Hello, everyone. It's new set season, which means it's, of course, time for a new tier ranking video. Once again, I'm joined by the extraordinary Andre.
Hey, thanks for having me. This is exciting. I'm so stoked to do this.
Yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun. I thought the Midnight Sun video was had some really wild power level cards and interesting discussions, and then I think Parhelion has come in and just thrown a crazy monkey wrench into how we think about Netrunner, basically.
Yeah,
Um,
I think we should explain at this point too. Like, we're 2 days into the set. The set drops on Friday. We're recording this on the Sunday. And in terms of like us playing the cards, I've played a bunch of these cards a bit, like a very small bit. And I know it's worth saying that, Jeff, you do play testing, so you've played with these cards for a while now in different forms, if not even the final form. So our opinions here are like really early. This is a kind of our knee-jerk reaction. And of course, like last time, we're excited to reevaluate this maybe in a month after some competitive events. Maybe the meta settles and we'll see if we're, on the money. Well, last time we were like just about there, right?
Yeah, last time we made zero mistakes. We definitely don't have memes following us around in all sorts of communities. And yeah, so you should check out when this after this video goes live. I think probably within hopefully a week,
Yeah.
maybe a bit more depending. We'll have the other half of this on Andre's channel, the Metropole Grid, which I'm assuming you're already following. If you're not for some reason, you should go fix that and watch this video. And there'll also be links to the previous sets in the description here. But yeah, basically the idea here is we're going to go through every single card on the Corp side in Parhelion, and we're going to put it into the categories. Those categories are Ban Me Please. These are cards that we think are egregiously high in power level and will be flirting with the ban list more or less for the entirety of their existence. Next up, we have Faction Staple. The idea of this card is not always that they are the strongest card in the set, but they are a card that you're basically always going to be putting in your deck, or always going to be thinking about putting in your deck if you're playing that faction. Next up, we've got Archetype Role Player. The idea is that these cards they could be stronger than the faction staple, but they're probably stronger only in a deck that's specifically catering to that kind of style of play.
So
And some archetype role play. Oh, go ahead.
no, sorry, I didn't cut you out. So I'll jump in right there real quick. So for the edit. Yeah, this is actually really interesting because when it comes to the Borealis cycle, it's really pushing new archetypes, right? Like we've seen keywords that are archetypes. On the Corp side, you don't really get keywords, but you get like, oh, this is the core damage ID. So you're going to see a lot of that. And we talked about before we recorded this, whether we wanted to rename our categories, because last time there was so much archetype role playing going on in Midnight Sun, but I still think we have a good enough ability to kind of push things up or down.
Yeah, and because we also do the ranking within archetype role player, that's going to help a lot. Where stuff on the left of top left of archetype role players probably pretty good. Stuff on the bottom right we're maybe a little dubious of.
Yeah.
The next category is niche. These are cards that could exist or that do exist and can do things, but probably won't make it into decks. And then shame are cards that we think kind of just shouldn't really they're just not going to see play probably ever. And sometimes it's a bummer, but then again, one of these days a shame card will come back and haunt us, and that'll be a fantastic day.
Yeah, like in terms of niche and shame, some of the stuff we said in Midnight Sun, we put cards in niche as like, this is a very specific effect that not every deck needs. You're not going to see it all the time, but sometimes they're the most powerful effect. And actually some of the niche cards we put in our last reviews ended up being like technically faction staples, if not even Ban Me Please to some extent. So like, that's a really volatile category because it's something interesting. Sometimes it's just, you don't always need it. Sometimes it's the best thing you can put in your deck.
Very cool. I think maybe we should just plow ahead into the first card.
Cool. So I'm going to have these on screen. Jeff can't see them right now, but he's aware of what these say. So we're going to start here with Tule Subsea. It's the new HBID 4515. And it says whenever the runner steals an agenda, do a core damage, unless they also pay a click and 2 credits. Not an additional cost to steal. So they can't like decide not to steal an agenda that doesn't also have an additional cost. So it's going to be quite taxing, especially if you have a lot of small agendas, supposedly. Core damage, HB, it's kind of been a thing, but this is the most, I think, direct core damage identity that probably has a win condition associated to it. What do you think about Subsea, Jeff?
Oh boy, I've got a lot of thoughts on Subsea. I think it's it is a type of HB that is not like the way that I like to play HB. So it's already a little weird for me to evaluate it from that context. That said, I think it's a really nice revisit of or it's like an HB. To me, this immediately reminds me of something like Argus,
Yeah.
where the idea was that, oh, Argus had a similar thing, but a little more of a Weyland flavor. So you took meat damage or tags rather than taking a core and paying taxes. Um, and so that led to this kind of very rushy build around style. With Thule, I don't know how exactly you build into this clearly. There's obviously a way that they're building with the rest of the cards in this set. But to me, it's a little bit like it's trying to build that. I immediately go, oh, can we build Argus and HB now? And I'm not sure we really can. So
Yeah, this is worth saying. Probably we should have said this at the top, but when we're talking about these cards, we're going to be talking about them largely when it comes to the standard card pool. So that's a larger card pool, more than just the Null Signal Games startup. We'll probably be mentioning startup every once and again because startup, these cards are very interesting in startup. Startup is a bit volatile right now, but we're talking about standard, and we're generally talking about like the highest level of competitive play. We're talking about tournament play. So while obviously Thule is like really, really fun, it's whether it can convert to those W's at the high tables. And yeah, that's really interesting. Core damage has been like an HB thing that's kind of like it's been a cool thing you can do, but it's really hard to leverage core damage into a win condition. And while we do see cards specifically in Parhelion that can very directly or at least really help you leverage core damage into a win condition, it's still asking for a lot. And HB classically, like HB is just consistently wins worlds year after year on being a very efficient and a very robust deck. And this is the exact opposite. This is like economically just struggling constantly. This is an anti-economy ability. Like, and it's not efficient. It needs to do a lot of work and then still find a win condition on top of it. Like you're doing kind of the opposite thing HB, but you still have, you know, some of those good HB cards, I reckon. This thing is really
yeah,
difficult.
I think that's the really difficult tension, I think, in this idea is that like your faction is built to do one thing, and then this idea is saying, but what if we did something else? And if you can find a way to make that work, I think this idea like undeniably has some power, and we're going to talk about a bunch of really important support cards for it as we keep going through the rankings. But I think the fundamental challenge I see with Thule becoming anything that I'm too worried about in a competitive scene is it's just so poor.
Yeah.
So much of like sports metal, ASA, and precision design have all in some way are solving this economic problem that HB has and this efficiency problem that HB needs to do to kind of win because HB plays the fairest of all of the corps. And so its lever to be unfair is usually just be a little bit economically ahead of the curve. And their whole card pool is kind of built around that. And Thule doesn't have that built into the ID.
It's really strange too. So like core damage, if that is your win condition, it's honestly for runners, it's not that hard to tech against, right? You can play Caldera, you can pay more money. Obviously that gets expensive on some of the other Thule taxes, but like that is something that if it becomes a large part of the meta, I don't think it will be, you can deal with it, right? Like you can tech around it. But on top of that, like core damage as a win condition could also exist outside of Thule. Like Thule has a core damage ability, but I do think some of the cards in this deck, which are supported by the ability, are actually just fine enough cards on their own. Again, I don't think that's going to be a tier 1 archetype, but like there's a chance that the best core damage deck isn't even in Thule. Maybe you just need to play an ID that has more money, and maybe even then it's more surprising. Because we'll mention this when we come to the other cards. It's not about doing like 6 core damage and negative hand size eventually is a flat 9. It's about like getting enough core damage that either another win condition arises either with the agendas or with just doing like big bursts of damage to follow it up. So I don't even know if this is the premier core damage ID.
I think that's a really good point. And the other thing I'll say quickly, and then we should probably rank it so that we're not here talking for like 6 hours.
It's so
about
easy
each
to do
card.
that. Yeah, I know.
I know this set's great because there's so many things. There's a lot of these cards have a lot of complexity and discussion that you can have about them. But the other thing is the runner is usually incentivized to run in their first couple of clicks anyway against HB because of the effective bioroids.
Yeah.
And so unless you're forcing them to run last click, like they probably can just be like, okay, I'm just going to go a little bit slower, make sure I always run early in the turn, and maybe I just turn your ID off. I don't know.
And go slower is fine because this is not a particularly fast deck, at least what I've seen so far. And
Yeah.
I think there's a big ceiling of potential of how you could build this thing. But yeah, you can just go a bit slower and hopefully that works out for you. Where do you think we're putting this? This one's
Yeah.
like a really interesting card, and again, I think it's really fun, and I'm excited to play it. But competitively, it's probably pretty far from the best thing HB can do.
Yeah, I like this card. Arguably, you could put in niche, but I think we'll probably end up at the bottom of our archetype role player.
Yeah.
Um,
It's definitely an archetype, but it's not the best core damage card, I think, in the set, which is pretty wild considering it's the ID that does that. All right, speaking of core damage, this is, man, the flavor and the art here is fantastic. Ontological Dependence,
Yeah, it
4/2
really is.
for this agenda, and it gets -1 advancement requirement for each core damage the runner has. It can go down to 0/2. It can go down to technically negative, but that actually doesn't do anything. This is like the first big payoff for core damage, and it's really wild to see this because you generally think core damage is going to be associated with like flatline, and this is the opposite. This is just with 2 core damage, a 2/2 agenda, which is just bonkers powerful in this game.
Yeah, I think the fact that this can be a 2/2 after just 2 core damage is pretty wild. Like that core damage is generally harder to land, but it's not impossible to land, and there's a lot more options for landing it come Parhelion. So I'm much higher on this card than I am on Thule as a whole.
Yeah, and it solves one of the inherent problems with core damage. The thing is, like, core damage wasn't very impactful classically in Netrunner. Back in the day, it was called brain damage. If you played Stim Hack, the idea is that runners would go out their way. They don't mind taking 1 or 2 core damage. And this really gives Thule or the core damage archetype teeth. It's like 1 core damage, it's a 3/2, that's fine. People play those. But then suddenly 2 core damage while you're not that close to a flatline, the game is entirely different. And I really like that design space here.
Yeah, I could even see, I mean, I don't think this is going to be the world we go in, but I could see a world where like every faction has a core damage cybernetic that they could consider playing right now. So you might even be like, oh, I need 2 points to round out my agenda suite. Maybe I'll throw a 1 of ontological dependence in, and it will become a 3/2 or a 2/2 just without me having to do any work for it sometimes, which is, I don't think, going to be a good place for it, but a possibility sometimes.
I've heard people discuss this, right? Like to add this into your ASO list, to add this into your non-core damage, like your non-Thule list. Just if you can give 1 or 2 core damage, is this just good enough of a payoff? And I'm on the fence of that. I think though it's definitely one of the most important core damage cards in the whole set.
I also do want to say I'm excited because this means that core damage can actually score out, which is historically a thing that those sort of decks really struggle to do, which often make the games miserable where the runner has lost. They're like, okay, well, I don't get to make any more runs. Let's sit here and twiddle our thumbs for 20 turns. And this says, no, you've got the core damage. Just go and end the game.
Yeah.
So
yeah, if you played old core damage decks, you know, it's hard to close a game out. This helps a lot. I think this is obviously, like, I don't think it's a faction staple yet. It's definitely an archetype role player. It's a huge role player. And I think it's a fair bit left of Thule.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
These easy ones, it's like really easy at the beginning of the list where you can, you know, there's only so many options. So, okay. Another core damage card here. It's Nightmare Archives. Hold on. Sorry. That thing, the visual bugged. All right, another card here. We got another core damage card, Nightmare Archives. It's an ambush, so it triggers even when it's accessed from R&D, even when it's accessed from archives, of course. When the runner hits this, it's either take -1 agenda points or a core damage. And this is the first, I think, real archive trap, I guess, that Null Signal Games has printed. I guess there's that yellow one that does bad publicity or tag thing, but yeah,
increased drop rates.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, or
yeah,
Cyberdex, or excuse me, Mavirus. But this is like what people imagine when they think of an archive trap.
Yeah, and I think if your goal is to play the million little agenda Thule deck, this is playable there. But I feel like for most of the time, like the runner's just going to take -1 point and keep going on about their day. And we're not in a game changer meta, right? The worst that's going to happen to you is maybe a fast break or a stock buyback. So I'm not that scared of this, even though I'm not the biggest, you know, this is not a card I love as well. So I'm a little bit like, let's just diminish it so that I don't have to see it in my games, kind of thing.
So like decisions or cards like that gives your opponent a decision. That's something that's classically been pretty bad in any card game because your opponent will take, you know, whatever's the least bad option for them. And I think it's super important to understand with this card is like a single core damage in any deck outside of Thule, like largely is not impactful. It does not change much in the game itself. So you can't really just jam this into like your NBN deck and hope that it actually matters because probably your opponent can say, I'm going to take a core damage. You spend 4 influence on that. That obviously doesn't make a lot of sense. But even if you do into non-core damage HB, like you can probably just take a core damage. Your deck needs to be capitalizing on that. And another important thing is you have to make sure the -1 agenda point actually impacts how many agendas the runner needs to score. If they only hit 1 of these and then your deck is all like 2-pointers and then a global food initiative, they still win on 4 agenda scores. So that actually doesn't matter unless they interact with 2 of these Nightmare Archives and they take the negative points on both of them. So I think when you play this, you have to care about your agenda suite. You have to obviously care about core damage. And for that case, I do think the Thule multiple agendas, the Giardino field, stock buyback, all that sort of stuff, which is like pseudo sports metal, which is a good agenda suite for Thule inherently, if you want your ability to be relevant for longer, is cool. It's kind of interesting and it makes the game longer, but I don't know. I'm hoping a core damage deck can end the game a bit sooner than drag it out to like turn 15. And it's a struggle for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one's weird, man. Like
it's a weird one. Yeah, it's funny because it's like, oh yeah, what about it? Because like I'm not that sold on it in like a Thule deck or a sports metal deck. I think even though it's maybe taking one agenda that they have to steal and adding an additional one to that, I'm not sold that solves a problem that deck has.
It's strange. Like in my very limited testing, it has bought me extra turns of the game, right? Like you can jam 2 of these, 3 of them into a Thule deck. Sports metal, I don't think is that easy as a sell because core damage doesn't matter. But like it actually buys you a longer and longer window, and specifically with cards like distributed tracing that has, you know, a shelf life based off of if the runner steals more and more agendas, you have a chance of doing something cool with it. It buys you a longer game and actually can open up windows later on before you actually eventually lose. So I actually don't mind this thing, like, but it's very narrow which deck it plays in. Like I think it's specifically has to be core damage many agendas or it almost doesn't matter.
Yeah, and I don't know that you have to play core damage. I don't know that you have to play many agendas to play the core damage deck, I guess. So to me, it feels like a niche of a niche kind of thing.
Yeah, maybe. In Thule, inherently, you want to play a lot of small agendas just so your ability fires a lot. Not that we saw like Argus 1-pointer decks because that doesn't win. So
that was actually, yeah, that was going to be the point I immediately went to is like Argus has a parallel ability and like people tried the 1-point Argus and it was just bad, it turned out.
Yeah, because you can't afford to score your agendas out, let alone like you can't win on agendas anyways when you have to score, you know, like 21 advancements or whatever it is. Like it's a bit nonsense. So yeah. I do think that people might come to a middle ground where they play Thule with 11 agendas instead of like 16 or whatever you could possibly get away with.
Yeah.
So where are we thinking about this? Like I think it's potentially more niche than Thule, but it's I think easier to feel okay about, I guess.
My inclination for right now is to put it in niche because as you were talking about during deck, it has to fit in a very specific type of deck construction.
Yeah.
In a subset of decks, so I think that's a reasonable starting point for niche.
Okay. Yeah, I'm okay with that. It's obviously an archetypal card, but yeah, it's maybe not even the best card in that archetype. Speaking about an archetype, and this is a really cool return because we talked about Harmonix Ice. We saw 2 Harmonix Ice from Midnight Sun. These are the next 2 from Parhelion. And our Harmonix Ice, classically, if you haven't watched the Midnight Sun review, they did not end up well on this chart. So obviously the whole set has to be reevaluated, but at least we're going to start with probably the stronger one here. This is Bloop. It's a Sentry, Destroyer, AP, Harmonic, and Harmonic Ice care about other Harmonic Ice. This does it in a very weird, indirect way. To res this, you have to de-res another obviously res Harmonic Ice, and this thing is just a massive amount of numbers and good subroutines on a piece of ice. It's only 2 influence, but you generally have to be playing more Harmonics, trash 2 installed programs, do 1 core damage on 3 subroutines. Is ridiculous for 3 cost 5 strength, right? Like this is the Archer, the HB Archer, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
What do you think of this one?
I mean, this is a really solid program. I think if this card had a different res condition, it would just be everywhere. Like every single HP deck would run this because this ice, it just has amazing numbers and it does a lot of stuff you want to do. It's not like unbeatable. The runner could just waltz through it if they want to. So you have to do some more work to make this really end in the most impactful way. But no, I mean, this card is undeniably a really good ice. I think the downside is the rest of the Harmonic Ice are not great.
Yeah. So like, okay. Bloop is obviously a very good ice in theory, but I think it's also one of the ice in the game that is going to face check and connect the least out of any ice in the game possible because the it broadcasts itself coming from a mile away, right? Like one of the most
Yeah.
common patterns is you don't want to run 3 bloops in your deck. Maybe you could, because the downside to derezzing an ice is actually an upside to the harmonics as long as your economy is there to back it up, which is another issue with like two-lay harmonics decks. Not that you have to play this in two-lay. But the idea with this card is that you don't want to run too many of them. And so then you generally pull it with, I'm going to say Wave, the harmonics names. I
Got
think it's
it.
Wave, right? Yeah, okay. So you pull it
You
with
got it.
Wave,
Yep.
which means you have to reveal it to your opponent. And then as soon as your opponent sees the runner sees like a single harmonics ice, they have to play the whole game as if there's bloops on the table as soon as you have one other ice res that's harmonic, which means that as long as they can afford to be a bit slow, which again, two-lay isn't particularly fast, not that this has to be a two-lay card, they can prepare for this. And still, even if you have a breaker, like this is 4 counters off of endurance, this turns out to be like, what is it? 5 credits. It's like the same break cost for an Anansi, barring you could like boomerang
Well,
through it.
yeah. But that said, like, hey, I paid 3 credits for that Anansi,
Yeah.
or to get an Anansi equivalent. Like so the payoff is quite high on this.
No,
But
it
yeah,
definitely
the
is.
broadcast is a big downside, and also it's a little positional. Like this
Yeah.
can't be the innermost ice on a scoring remote. I think it's fine to have on a central. It probably means the owner's not going to run that central, which is like pretty nice for one piece of ice. But it's got this like both positional and I'm going to call it like temporal problem where like you have to have it can't be the first like if you've set up your remote and they're like, okay, I've got bloop followed by an echo on my scoring remote and the runner hasn't run anywhere yet. Well, you actually just have a 1 subroutine echo on your scoring remote, and you're going to feel pretty sad about it.
It's like we're 1 card short of this, and I don't know whether we should just insert divert power unironically into a harmonics deck, but it's like the same thing. We want 1 card like this for this and for op, where we can res our stuff in the order we want them, because that's just an ongoing problem with the harmonic set. Not only are they technically positional, this one's the worst, I guess, but the temporal problem with harmonic ice is such a struggle. Echo is still the most difficult ice to get enough value to be like really excited about it, and this is kind of in that category. This thing is weird. I like it's in theory so good that you could see some decks splashing like 4 influence to play like 2 or 1 bloop, 2 wave, right? Like that's a 4 influence ice package. That's like not awful. But like
Oh.
the bloop is never gonna bloop people. Dag is gonna hiss, but Dag's gonna be safe, right? Like you're gonna see this thing coming from a mile away.
I think as people stabilize into more competitive decks,
Yeah.
we're going to see fewer and fewer people get blooped. I think everyone's getting blooped left and right on
Ah,
early days.
if you know the cards in the set and you know there's a new harmonic, I don't think you should get blooped ever. Right? Like this thing, you see it screaming from the distance, it's yelling at you, making that big old bloop sound. I have never seen this face connect yet.
Oh, I've already connected this, so
Okay. Nice. Yeah, it probably
uh,
feels good when it does. Like it's actually one of the best, like I think, to hit with for sure.
yeah,
Where do you want to put this? This
yeah.
one's
Giving a
really
little trade
interesting.
is nice. I think archetype role player is fine. I think maybe the other one will go in niche, but I think this one, like if you're gonna play it, this is the one that defines set. Yeah, that's where I would put it.
Cool. Yeah. It's like it's so close to being a faction staple. It is technically one of the best HB ice, but like the support package around it just kind of drags it down a wee bit. Speaking of that, and maybe not exactly, let's not color this too hard. This is Pulse. It's the last harmonic. So we're looking at 4 harmonics right now. So you can have up to 12 in your deck. It's a code gate. It's only 1 strength, but it has 2 subs. And when you res this, it has a really good ability. The runner loses a click if they can, if able. 2 separate teams. The first one says the runner loses a credit for each res piece of harmonic ice. So it's the opposite effect of wave in some ways. And then the runner ends their run unless they spend a click. So last click, it's kind of like a reverse anti-enigma. They lose a click and then they can get through this without a breaker as long as they have extra clicks left. Inherently, well, that is something that works well with two-lay, where people want to run and have clicks left to steal agendas and not take core damage. It's also anti-synergistic with two-lay, because that's the one ID that people are most likely to run early in some ways, like run first click, and then you can lose 2 clicks to this and still be kind of okay. Sort of. Not exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this ice is really interesting.
Yeah.
It feels pretty reasonable, but then whenever I've played it, it's been a little underwhelming because the end the run is not a hard end the run. It's so much softer than it first looks. It's hard I like this when you're like, oh yeah, I have a hard end the run and this on a scoring remote, and this just click taxes the runner really nicely. but you can't build this as your like foundation to a scoring remote unless you can really force the runner to only run late in the turn, and that's really tricky to do.
This one's weird too. Like, even if you're only running 2 pulse and you're not playing HP and you're splashing this for influence, if this card just says when you res a lose a click, end the run, and they lose a credit or lose 2 credits, that's not a bad ice for 3 cost, right? Like, it's comparable to Enigma, it's comparable to White Space. It's break cost for like Black Orchestra, the Anarch staple. It's the same as like Magnet, and Magnet obviously is a very powerful card for its own reasons. But if you're playing like a rush deck or a deck and we're accessing late in the turn, like maybe you have NBN tag traps, maybe you're doing something interesting, maybe you're playing this with border control, maybe you can pull this with op at instant speed to lose the click after the border control fires. Like, there is a high chance that this is a good enough ability to even play outside of harmonic support, and it's interesting. But it's another card that if the runner, has extra clicks, it's just like a speed bump. It's not as powerful as you want it to be. But maybe when
Yeah.
you're playing in a different faction, they're not expecting to run early, and that can be a real benefit. I think this card's actually quite fascinating because just the numbers alone don't seem that bad, or just the text.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because it's like in some ways this is a more powerful Enigma, and in other ways it's a not as good Enigma.
Yeah.
And so it's really but it's like in that same, it's occupying that same slot in where I want to think about deck building. And maybe the correct way is, no, I have to reframe this and put this in a different context to find the areas where it's really going to shine the most.
Enigma is good. Enigma has classically been one of the best netrunner ice through the history of the whole game. It's been around since 2012, and it's always relevant. And like, this is an interesting pseudo Enigma. Kind of
Yeah.
cool.
It really is.
Where do you want to put this thing? I think I'm hotter on this than blue for some reason.
You're hotter on this than blue.
Well, just because it's more playable. Like, it's not nowhere near as like brute powerful as blue, but like I do think it's a widely playable card.
Yeah. Okay. I was gonna say I'm a little bit less hot in it than Bloop, but like pretty close. Like,
Yeah.
I think they're pretty tough. Like, I think also this is the best harmonic. Well, okay. Like this and Wave, I think, are maybe the best for like, but Wave is like best mostly for reasons unrelated to the harmonic package as a whole, I think.
Yeah.
And then Pulse is the one I expect to see the most next, I guess.
Yeah. I think that's fair.
Yeah, so actually, you know what? As we're talking about this, yeah, I think maybe to the left of Bloop is totally reasonable.
Cool. Yeah, it's interesting, and I think you can see it outside of harmonics, and I think that's a huge thing because I don't think anyone's really that well, at least I don't think we're very excited about the harmonics package as a whole, especially. And this is like one of the bigger things we talked about this in Midnight Sun review, is that HB has really good ice. And not playing that to play the harmonics package is now even a taller cost on top of all of that sort of stuff. So the harmonics, I'm not expecting to see a lot of play in HB. The HB ice is just way too good.
It might be that as rotation sets in, we see more and more of the harmonics because there's been some talk of ice power going down overall. But up until that point, HB's got some really solid foundations.
Cool. Okay. Speaking of solid foundations, this is a really strange card to see in purple, but this is distributed tracing. It's 3 costs and a double, so you spend 2 clicks to do this. Only play it after the turn in which the runner has stolen an agenda, and you just give them a tag. It's 4 influence, which is a lot. But I was so surprised to see a card in HB that says give a tag, let alone this directly. This has some direct support in the set, not only in HB faction, but I do think there's a strong card to talk about this in the Weyland set that works as a way to close the game with core damage. Using a tag and then reduce hand size to flatline the runner is very potent, potentially. Otherwise, can you afford to just play this to trash a resource for your whole turn in 5 credits? Kind of a tall ask. What do you think about this one?
Yeah, I mean, it's really tricky. To me, to some extent, there's this clear design direction that like, oh yeah, we want to give more access to tags for other factions and see what they can do with tags in different factions. I guess we're only seeing that explored into HB so far this set because NBN and Weyland have both historically done a lot with tags, and we see them play with it too. So like it is tricky to think about. Like, to me, this fits in a single deck in HB right now, but it does seem like it's a card that we're going to keep coming back to and reevaluating as new cards get added. And even at 4 influence, there's probably a deck out there somewhere that does want to look at this, splashing it out of faction, because it is an uncontestable tag, which is only otherwise achievable with mutually assured destruction, which is a triple. So
Yeah.
uh,
So you spoke about this showing up in one deck currently in HB. That would, I
yeah.
take it, be the two-lay core damage deck?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's the two-lay core damage deck that where the goal is you just give the runner 2 core damage, then their hand size is 3, they steal an agenda, you distribute tracing, and then end of the line, which we'll talk about later.
And
Um,
to
and
me, and this is going to be a problem that's just going to like paint over most of our, or at least my impressions for some of these cards, like distributed tracing and end of the line are generally very, very powerful effects. There are certain metas where if this dropped, this would be just like the sky is falling, very, very, very strong, very hard to deal with. But to me right now, one of the big issues is that currently in the standard meta, tag decks for the last competitive season have been very powerful. Things like Drago have kind of just been a problem. So people are playing No Free Lunch, the other what's it called, Midnight Sun tech card to deal with tags, and every deck is running 1, 2. Some of them are running 3, just because if you can't deal with Drago, you're going to lose on a competitive format. So for that reason, I don't know if I want to play this card. Like, I don't know if that's an archetype where single tag punishment is something you can really pursue. Maybe there's a chance that players will, I'm going to say, misplay around HB decks and not keep their No Free Lunch. Maybe they pop it for 3 credits to deal with the too late credit tax. But that's one of the big things to me is like, while this card is incredibly powerful, I think right now might be one of the worst times to play it.
no, I completely agree. The proliferation of Don't Free Lunch and even Stone Chip Chart Room ends up being really annoying for that kind of kill strategy. It's going to be difficult to make this consistently land payoff kills.
Yeah. But yeah, the fact that maybe in some meta that you can spend 4 influence, even in NBN that has things like Public Trail, maybe getting a single tag is going to be so important in the game. I do think single tag punishment has kind of died down a bit. It's no longer, you just lose the way that it used to be in early Netrunner, maybe 10 years ago at this point. But yeah, that makes me like, it's obviously an incredibly powerful card, and it's kind of refreshing to see that in HB, and it opens up some possibilities, but I do not know if it's a strong card right now.
Yeah, no, I agree. It does seem pretty weak in the current meta. Um, I don't have a. This is where it's like, oh man, I wish we had come up with that extra category so we could put this in this. It's part of an archetype, but it's not a good archetype. Or it's a suspicious archetype at the moment.
Yeah, I think for that reason, I might put this top of niche. It's the same idea. Like the potentially, this is a very, very good card. It's just right now, I would not be excited to sleeve this one up.
Yeah.
Does that sound fair?
I think that sounds very fair.
Okay, cool. Now, HB tags, we have another card to go with this. If you want to spend your whole turn, you can also throw on top of it a Hypoxia, Call of Duty Black Ops, play only if the runner's tagged, do 1 core damage. The runner also gets -1 clicks allotted for their next turn. And then you remove this thing from the game because recursion could potentially be poisonous with this thing. So clearly the obvious play here is to spend your whole turn for some reason to do a core damage and make the runner lose a click. Making the runner lose a click is kind of nice in two-lay because then they have less ways to interact, not only with HB Ice or Bioroids in general, but then like defensive upgrades, but of course the two-lay tax. What do you think about this one? Like it's so hard to talk about this thing because it almost directly has to relate in power level with the card we previously talked to, because that's the only way that HB can consistently tag you without spending influence. And I do think honestly maybe spending influence to tag is correct with this card if it's that good of a payoff.
Yeah, yeah. I think this card's not that great of a payoff though. In most of the time, like I think there's other better ways to land core damage in this set.
Yeah.
And just kind of generally in the card pool even. Um, and to some extent, it's like, oh yeah, this card reads a bit like, oh hey, the core damage isn't that good. Like, so let's just tack on a little bit of an extra penalty onto it of the -1 click, which like
It's weird.
yeah has some upside, but most like you're kind of trading a card and then for a core and a click, and it's not clear to me how you're going to be able to leverage that into some kind of consistent advantage.
So there's a card that has seen almost no competitive play that I'm considering my two-lay deck, which is Riot Suppression, which is a reprisal, and it gives the runner either the choice, I believe, of a core damage or lose 3 clicks next turn. And while that gives your opponent a decision, those are generally, again, not the best cards that you can play in your deck. The cool thing about those cards is that it allows you to at least do something the turn after you play it. The problem with the play of the distributed tracing into Hypoxia is that's your whole turn. So a lot of times you want to give the runner 1 fewer click, so it's harder for them to interact with something you've put on the board. It's like install something in a server, then hard-hitting news. So now you have 2 problems to deal with, but this is so difficult to fork a runner unless you like public trail him to give him a tag, unless you like pop up an MC austerity policy and have the most ridiculous turn where you play 3 of these, and then even then it's hard to put something on the table that you could have scored an agenda. So I don't know.
Yeah.
We talked about two
I
core
mean,
damage being important, but like this is not the
yeah.
easiest way to do two
Maybe
core damage.
maybe the payoff is you actually are protecting a Drago with this, and so it's not taking up your entire turn, but you're instead protecting a Drago, and then you get to go and land one or maybe even two Hypoxias, and now all of a sudden that whole turn looks a little bit different, right? Because now it's like, oh, the runner's splitting a tag. They have only one or two. They only have 2 or 3 clicks if I can play a couple of these, and I've got a Drago in the remote, and so it's a hard fork on the runner in a bunch of ways.
It's so alien to me to think about like splashing NBN cards, let alone like Drago into an HB deck. But I think you might be onto something there with like 3 Hypoxia, and then you can run 3 copies of Restore to be like a really poisonous Drago deck. Like maybe you can make Tag Prison be legitimate. And mainly, how is that deck also going to care about core damage? I don't know. But yeah,
End of
it's at
the
least
line, I guess. You're splashing Drago, end of the line. So your
yeah.
entire deck is all predicated on this idea that you're somehow getting the rest of, like, you're that just is betting that the econ package and the ice package of HB is making up for the fact that you're spending all your influence on win conditions from another faction.
Yeah, which I don't know, maybe. Load testing doesn't see play. Is this good enough? Load testing plus core damage plus tag necessary. It's kind of a hard sell, but I do think that you made me much more interested about this card just talking about the Drago Prison, unfortunately.
Yeah, next time you walk up to a GNK, someone's playing Reality Plus Hypoxia, and
Yeah, they'll get you good. At least it removes itself from the game. So, Spin Doctor, you're gonna have less to do.
yeah. Oh man, if this didn't and there was clone suffrage movement, just rolling 3 of these every turn,
Let's
that'd be
go.
something else.
Where do you want to put this one? This thing's really strange. It's a very weird card.
I think it's probably the nichest of the niche cards we've talked about so
Yeah,
far.
I think that's fair.
Even though it has potentially interesting uses,
I
there's maybe an argument it could go in shame, but it seems a little bit bold.
Yeah, we were talking about this before, and we said last time we did this, we had more cards in Archetype Role Player. I do think, and this doesn't mean the quality of the cards or the set or our interest in them is any different. I think we might see more cards in the shame category, but I think we're just trying to be a bit more discerning. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was a little bit silly to have like half of like almost half the cards in Midnight Sun in Archetype Role Player. So there's going to be a kind of, I think, trying to bell curve the things, or like spread out the rankings a little bit more for this set.
Again, we'll adjust this as we go through the video, but that's the idea. All right, we got another one. Jupstad Grid. This is a region. It costs 4 to res before to trash 2, and it says when you score an agenda in the root of the server, do a core damage. This is one of the very few cards in the game that just does core damage. Obviously, you have to score an agenda. Maybe you wanted to do that anyways to win the game, but that's a very powerful effect. If you've been playing core damage decks, a lot of the times you kind of have to either force the runner into a situation where they have to take core damage or trick the runner into taking core damage. And this is one of the very few cards in the game that just says, here's some core damage, and that's incredibly valuable.
Yeah, and this card is now like, I would say, oh, this card has a huge cost because it's like, oh, I have to put my agenda in here and spend a whole turn advancing it. But with a 2-1 in faction, that's less of a big ask than it has basically ever been for HB.
Yeah. It's also a card that go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's also a card. While it is expensive, it's not a card that you have to res until it does something. So there's going to be a lot of situations where the runner finds the remote server, and you could play Tranquility Grid in this slot. Like the Raging slot in HB is actually high contested, especially potentially in Tule that doesn't have a lot of economy that can't afford this. But the idea is that the runner probably trashes this in a lot of situations before you have to spend 4 credits. So do you just trade a run in 4 credits? Is that good enough for a card slot? It's not the worst place to be in.
Yeah, especially when that card slot then leverages your game plan pretty well. Like generally CTN, like NBN players would play Sand City Grid, not because they were going to get res it even most games, but the runner kind of had to go and deal with it because the games where it could get resed, it was kind of winning. And Jupstad Grid seems like it's maybe in that kind of similar lineage, though in a little bit of a narrower kind of deck archetype.
And what I've seen so far from Tule too is that it's sometimes hard, and obviously this will get better with time when people are more familiar with the card pool. But just like jamming cards into a remote server, like 2 upgrades, an upgrade and an asset, runners kind of can struggle to deal with that, because we'll talk about the next card. That card can be really tricky to be seen in multiples. It's kind of hard to understand what Thule wants to do to you. So even just like getting uniced cards in remote servers, like, is it a snare when I have core damage? Is it a prize sack? Is it something that's going to be a tempest? Like, there's a lot of weird tricks and traps that Thule can make you uncomfortable with. And so there's a chance that this does just survive in a remote server a bit longer than you think it could. But
Yeah, I was about to say, like, I think one of the reasons this card seems really interesting to me is one line of play that you could take against Thule without this card existing is just say, yeah, you can do what you want on the remote. I can just probably access cards off centrals faster than you can score out.
yeah,
Because your deck is full of all these one pointers, and as much, you know, the runner takes one click to steal one of your one pointers, or maybe 2 clicks and a credit, and it's going to take you a turn and a bit to go and score it. But this Droop style grid says, no, you as the runner have to come in and get me, or I will come back and get you.
yeah. And
Pretty
again,
cool.
we talked about how the economy is a problem with this. I do think this is one of the cards that can actually lift the core damage archetype outside of Thule. The idea that in Asa, you can actually install this and a 2/1 in the same turn and pay 6 credits to get consistent core damage. Like, that's kind of neat if ontological dependence is a good enough payout. And then there's other stuff on top of that, like red level clearance. You can always cheap this down on a turn that you're also going to score a 2/1 or even fast events, or you already have an agenda on the table. Like, there's some things you can do with it. They're all very expensive and they all require core damage to have a payout. But there's a chance that, like, in a faction that has more economy, you can more comfortably play this card.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I'm thinking about where we're slotting this in.
Yeah.
And I might put it above the harmonics. Not sure. That's maybe a little high, but I feel like this card's pretty important to that archetype. And
Yeah.
maybe playable than,
It's just so wild to
I
see
don't
like a
know.
4-cost card in a core damage deck. Like, it just is so expensive to me that I don't
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
maybe with more economy options gets better, but I do think somewhere around there is good. Maybe we can just put it right to Bloop, because I do think we're going to see more Bloop than we are going to see this, at least for a bit.
I think that's probably a good read, yeah.
Okay. It's wild. Tule is like near the bottom here, and then it's yeah, I don't know. Again, I don't know if you need it for a core damage deck. It's definitely a good ability, but hey, we said what we thought about it, I reckon.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like that where it's like, oh yeah, here's this idea that supports it, but maybe you can be creative and find a way to use its tools well in other places. So I think it's a nice little encouragement.
Cool. Okay, we got one last one. It's an interesting card. It's a non-unique sys-up ambush. It's Mr. Hendrick, the triplets, right? When the runner accesses this upgrade while it's installed, you may pay 2 credits, kind of like a price sec, to do a core damage. However, the runner can lose the rest of their clicks of their whole turn as long as they lose clicks. Oh, if they have any remaining. So they have to lose clicks for you to do a core damage. And the fact that this card is not unique, which means if you stack 2 of them in a server, it's almost impossible for the runner not to take core damage as long as you can pay 4 credits, which is kind of neat. And this card is one of the, like, I think actually very important cards, and specifically with Thule, because Thule is going to tax clicks. So if the runner ever runs a remote server that has an agenda and Hendrick and hits Hendrick first, then Thule is going to always do damage. Or if they do in the opposite order, there's a chance that Hendrick always does damage. This is actually one of the cards that I'm most excited to see in any Thule deck in like my opening hand, because it sets up some like very surprising plays. It's actually really easy for the runner to misplay into.
Yeah, no, I think this card really adds to that kind of clown car HB payoff for these Thule decks. I think it is probably the strongest Thule support card outside of ontological dependency to me.
Yeah.
Where this is probably how you're going to land 1 to 2 core damage basically every game. I think if you play this correctly, because I think you can either wait till if you put this down with an agenda, it's almost always going to be a core damage. If you put 2 of these in the remote, it's basically guaranteed core damage. So it's got a lot of value to it, and it's an upgrade. So you can even just put it in, like, maybe the solution for Thule is you put down a Nico campaign and you put Mr. Hendrick in it and say, your choice, right? Like,
and you mentioned this before. One of the best things to do to Thule is obviously run early in the turn. Same with like Haas-Bioroids. So even outside of a Thule deck, and again, as soon as you start straying away from there, the core damage penalty of Hendrick becomes less and less intimidating. So do keep that in mind. But I've seen runners hit this because they're running for first click, because that's how you respect Thule, and then just lose their whole turn for 2 credits, which that's good. And they still have to trash this thing too. So like, that's a massive swing.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a huge swing.
Yeah. I like this. It also works with some of the other stuff. Like I want to play this with Prisec. That's I think a really good way to give a tag. It's kind of a no-win situation. Tag, meat damage, end your turn, take a core damage, pick like 2 of 4. And then on top of that, you can
Yeah,
play
yeah.
like Tempest and like a co-op project, which I'm not the hottest on because I feel like people are respecting that card inherently when they play as against Tule, but there's some really, really high
Yeah.
highs with this card. What are you
No, I
thinking?
agree. This card is I mean, I would buy arguments to either side of ontological dependency, I
I'm
think.
going left. This one seems like I think there's more decks that can consider playing this than ontological.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's reasonable enough. And I think honestly of the two cards you're more worried about Mr. Hendrick. Like ontological is one way to finish the game, but not the only way.
Yeah.
And Mr. Hendrick is the enabler for all of those. So I think that's a pretty reasonable way to set that up.
Awesome. Okay, so that is our HB cards. I believe we have 9 of them. Nothing so far hitting the faction staple. Not the biggest surprise. We did kind of see a trend like this, and that's because, you know, most of these HB cards are inherently core damage cards. So it's not saying too much. Like it's always faction support. I don't know if any of these cards are going to be in like every acid deck, every sports metal deck you're expecting, every precision design deck. But it's a really, really interesting thing. And we set this at the top. Getting HB to do something else than just pure efficiency is really refreshing for Netrunner.
No, it's a really nice like goal to kind of drive towards this difference, this sort of different style of HB. And I don't know for certain, but if I had to guess, you know, if you look at the last Worlds or last several years of Worlds, like HB is coming first or second. Maybe we can give them some off meta stuff for a little bit.
I think HB has won Worlds 4 years in a row, and I don't know if it goes further than that. That's as far as I checked. All right.
Yeah.
Hopefully we're giving someone some support outside of HB. This is the Jinteki ID. These are the 2 IDs that we haven't seen. So every faction got an ID in the whole Borealis cycle. And the Jinteki one is Iswak Adaptic, Sustaining, Diversity, 4515 Standard Fare. And it says, whenever you score an agenda you did not install or advance this turn, you get to place a power counter on its identity. And for each power counter hosted here, you need 1 less agenda point to win the game. Pretty exciting. It can put... this thing... Okay. Excuse me. This is a card that I'll admit I haven't had time to test yet. It technically wasn't working on Jinteki.net when I was doing a lot of my playtesting. It should be okay just about now. But it's a very open-ended identity, and I think there's a lot you could do with it. It's worth noting, if you haven't played this card yet, there's a lot of ways to put advancements on cards that are not considered advancing. Cards like Lacosta Grid, Seamless Launch, Trick of Light, anything that like moves or places advancements is not considered advancing. The term advancing is referenced on certain cards, but it's more the basic action of paying a click and a credit. So there's a lot you can do with this thing. I'm actually a bit nervous to talk about this one. Jeff, what do you think? I don't know if you're in a different camp as me.
I almost want to make a question mark category for this card alone because I have like this might be like there was I'm going to call it there's like a mind games style of Jinteki, whereas you're just going to play stuff like Mitosis. You're going to put 2 cards out with 2 advancement counters, and then you're going to manually install and advance more cards.
Yep.
And then some of those are going to be agendas, some of them are going to be traps. And you're just trying to say who gets lucky first. And my ID ability may be in a way that's different from PE, accelerates me when you don't call the traps correctly.
Yes, and I do think that's only one way to play this, but I think you're totally right.
And then I think the other way is like, hey, maybe you could just play a regular Glacier Jinteki, play like Lacosta and Seamless Launches, and then once per game, you're going to go, cool, I've got a big enough window. I'm just going to Seamless Launch and score this. And it wasn't installed. I didn't advance it. So this is a Nisei Mark II that's worth 3 points rather than 2. And that, you know, if you do that, or maybe more ideally, you play it in all 5/3 stack and just say, yeah, one of these 5/3s, I'm just going to cook for long enough to score it out. And now I just need to score 2 agendas to win the game. And that's a huge deal for any kind of Glacier deck.
It's always good when you look at a card like this that forces you to play other type of cards, like all the cards that place advancements instead of advancing. It's kind of good. It's good news that those cards are actually very good in Netrunner. Like Lacosta is a good card. Seamless Launch is one of the best cards in the game. So like that already gives us a hedge up, like a leg up. If you're already playing the good cards, it can't be too bad, right?
Yeah, I think the tricky thing is Jinteki Glacier has been in a really tough spot for years at this point, honestly. Like Panic Polana was a thing, but even while Polana was legal, it was falling out of favor.
Yep.
Um,
Economy is also a big question mark. Like Jinteki decks, the mid-range Jinteki decks, a lot of them were, kind of buoyed by Plana's free credit a turn, 2 credits sometimes a turn, and you don't exactly have it here. Like this is not. Maybe it saves you credits because the game is over faster because you won, but like it's not inherently an economic ability. And Jinteki got no economy cards in the set.
yeah, 0, which is going to make it really rough to play this ID. You got to find some kind of econ solution. So I think this card's probably going to be pretty weak in standard for the next 6 months, but it's one of those ideas I think we'll keep coming back to, and people will show up and have. Well, like this will be a deck I expect to see someone show up with it basically every tournament until
Yeah,
it rotates, kind of thing.
and I think some people are
And
going to do well.
it'll win
Yeah.
sometimes. Like, yeah.
But I think the big thing there, and we saw this in Continental season specifically, like just Jinteki PE decks that do install advanced events, you didn't run it, advance, and then you don't run it, or you do run it, and either it flatlines you because you didn't run it, it flatlines you because you ran it, and now with Iswak Adaptix, it will maybe win the game. We saw a deck like this in not Custom Biotics, excuse me, the brewery, the treehouse, whatever that one was called,
Bioeth? No.
I don't remember.
Well, that's also my thumbnail face sorted out.
So like that sort of ability, we actually saw something that was quite competitive to that. The sort of biotech decks that, that could flip and suddenly do 2 net damage. Eddie and Josh Quinlan played that at Worlds many years ago, and it was like one of the most exciting games to watch. It was technically like high stress, high tension netrunner, but it was, again, it takes the whole game, which we evaluate in a totally different financial, economic, click compression, all this sort of like tempo buzzwords, and it just becomes, did you run the right thing or did you run the wrong thing? Some people love that, some people don't like playing that, and this is, I don't even know if it's as potent as PE, which has more ways to get other win conditions off traps from centrals and other remote servers. So even that might not be the best way to do this.
Yeah, this might just be permission for the devs to at some point rotate PE and say, hey, we gave you an ID option. So yeah.
So it's strange. I don't know. It's also in some ways reminds me of Saraswati, which I'm not a big fan of, and allows you to do that sort of like tempo score, but getting more points is generally a bit better than saving a click here or there, I guess.
Yeah, if you can find a way to like have a scoring pattern that's normally like I score 2 normally I score 3 agendas and then now I score 2, or I normally score 4 agendas, now I score 3. Like that starts making a huge deal for how flexibly you can play the game. So I wouldn't be surprised if this did see some play because of that.
No, but that you mentioned, like the whole idea of lowering the score points, we should mention Harmony MedTech was a Jinteki agenda that just said each player needed 6 points to win the game. It also had economy problems and was a competitive card because of those things. And like Iswak kind of echoes that idea. It's like, that's a good ability if you can score 2 agendas to win the game, but you still have a lot of other problems you need to solve just inherently playing Netrunner that it doesn't really help. Where do we put Iswak?
I think I put it higher than Thule.
Yeah. Something like that.
I think that's reasonable. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. This is, again, big question mark. Somebody's going to break something with this and get like a really aggressive rush.
Yeah.
Like you put enough seamless launches in any deck, it's good in Netrunner. So we could be very wrong about that one. All right.
Yeah, for sure.
Hybrid release 2-1 agenda expansion. When you score this agenda, you may install a face down card from archives. Jinteki loves face down cards and archives. There's so much through this whole set that supports it, even all the way back to System Gateway. We've said this when we talked about the first 2-1s, and just about everyone got a 2-1 in this set, besides Weyland. They don't really need it. That 2-1 agendas, even if they had no text, in a lot of factions, in a lot of decks, are just like inherently playable because you do install advanced events, you get a point. If you play enough 4-2s or 3-2s, you can get the 6 points. This will be your 7th point. You win the game. Now, this effect is better than blank. I do think Elevagao Bifurcation, the last 2-1, sometimes is blank. A lot of times it isn't, but sometimes it is blank. Sometimes more often than not. But I think this is a better ability than Elevagao.
No, this may be the strongest 2-1 printed in this set, I think.
Yeah, I think by a mile.
And like I think it's actually strong enough that even if you don't like, you think about how you can adjust your agenda scoring pattern, I think, to see if you can fit this card in. Because there's a lot of like there's even worlds where like, oh hey, I discarded an agenda earlier, but the runner never ran my spin doctor, so I just get to put an agenda back in and accelerate my tempo even more.
Yeah.
Um, and we have a ton. I mean, and this is just playing off of a strong theme in the Jinteki cycle now of putting cards in archives at all points in time, and this just recurs them, and is a nice little payoff for that.
Yeah,
So
we see so many cards in the set, even more in this side as well, right? It's like, do you want to res an anemone and discard a card? Do you want to res a half run and discard a card? That's an expensive cost, and being able to recoup that and to make it a non-cost is really cool. And I like that. I do think
yeah,
one of my favorite plays with this thing, and again, making sure the cards are face down in archives is going to be potentially a problem once people adjust to playing against this thing. It's why a lot of people love restoring humanity to play their face down Regenesis. And to me, it makes no sense because that's the one like faction I'm checking archives on a consistent basis. So maybe you just play this in Isawak. But say in Isawak, you like install advanced in a remote server. It looks like NGO front, looks like some other nonsense, and the runner doesn't run it. There is a score paid ability window for agendas on the start of your turn. You can score this, make it worth pseudo 2 agenda points, and then install and res something that has a start of turn trigger like Reaper function, or just as basic as like a Rashida Yahim that's somehow face down in archives. Like that is a massive amount of value, and you still have a whole turn. Like obviously, if you
yeah.
install advance and don't get the 2-1 that you could have just scored, that's a legitimate cost and a risk you're taking on. But like that's a very powerful ability.
For sure. And then it's also worth shouting out, this does interact with Kakarembo pretty well. Kakarembo has no text on it saying you can't score this. So
Oh
you can
wow.
Kakarembo, flip all of archives face down, score this, and then get to recur whatever cards you want from archives. And that alone is like enough to make this maybe, I think like to me, this is maybe the first faction staple.
I think so.
Uh,
I hate that there's more Kakarembo support. That's a ban me card for me, but for other reasons. Yeah, okay. I do think this
yeah.
is really good. This is really good. PE loves it.
Yeah.
It's a neural EMP that can recur some sort of other nonsense net damage stuff. I do think there's a threat here that this does like 3 net damage with Reaper functions and PE. Like this is cool.
Yeah.
Faction? Staple?
Yeah. Faction staple.
Let's go. You did it, Jinteki. All right. Next up, Bianchan Keeling. Academic subtype. That's a new subtype. When you res this asset and when your turn begins, place a power counter on this. The runner gets -1 hand size for each hosted power counter. 4 to trash is like a lot more than you might expect on this card. And it's worth noting that negative hand size is technically a win condition in this game. It only triggers when the runner ends their turn and fails to discard down to negative cards. They are considered flatlined there. So you have to deal with Keeling sooner than later. On its own, having negative hand size is obviously scary when it comes to interacting with traps and all the Jinteki stuff, Obokata Protocol, all that sort of stuff. But this is, by definition, a must trash, as long as you can, you want to protect this as a corporation.
Yeah, for sure. No, I'm pretty high on this card. I think it does a lot of really powerful work because it's in Jinteki, where like, yeah, by the you res this at the end of the runner's turn,
that's huge.
like before the discard step. So then they have to discard 1 card just immediately. So 3 credits for a card, not a great exchange rate, but now you've given the runner a 4-card bounty that they have a 4-credit bounty that they have to go and spend some resources going to challenge.
Yeah, and then you can protect this with
so,
like anemone. You can get more damage on this, so you can force them into awkward situations, which might be just what you need to like push an Obokata on the table and like have a window. Which is, yeah, that's great. That's really good.
yeah, no, I think this deck, like, it has to be. You can't just put this in like 1,000 cuts net damage PE. But I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being a pretty common PE card that looks a little bit more, I'm going to say, like the Bridgman Worlds PE list, where it was like playing ice and building a remote and saying, I'm going to present you a challenge. And this is a great challenge that PE deck can put down that isn't going to cost it points, puts it down on the table.
I played a startup game where this was ice turn 1 and I died before I could find my breaker. Problem with the deck construction, but like, yeah, I'm actually scared of this one now because you have to deal with it sooner than later. And not only that, is that if your hand size is reduced, you're generally throwing out your worst cards, which means the cards in your hand are the good cards. And then if you ever take damage during the run to trash this or do anything else, then you're at a big disadvantage because you've lost your best stuff. The fact also this gets like basically 2 power counters and like you said, res this at the end of the runner's turn, so they have to discard a card, is like super generous. Like this seems like it gets power counters a bit faster than you think it could, and it's yeah, it's kind of cool. Where do you want to put it?
It's very nice. I'm gonna say archetype role player. I don't think it's quite a faction staple, but yeah, that's where I would put. I think it's the strongest of the cards we've talked about that aren't a staple.
I think there's a small chance that this could be an archetype staple. It's kind of the same thing as like, and
Yeah.
we'll talk about Gaslight, but it's like a thing that you need to deal with. And if you just need to put something in a remote server, obviously it costs a bit to res and you're going to have to protect it. But if it's like one of the best things to put in a remote server when you have nothing else going on, it may if the runner can see that coming, they'll just be like, you'll trash that before it actually matters. But yeah, I think you could potentially play it in a lot more decks than just like PE net damage.
Yeah, for sure. Like it definitely does fit in some kind of glacier deck if you can find a way to make that damage matter, and maybe you can play that kind of blood in the water oboe glacier game with this in some fashion.
Yeah.
But it's a little bit tricky to see exactly how that's going to work right now.
Blood in the Water is a good shout out, and it's really funny how people are probably more excited about the flashiness of Super Deep Borehole, and this might actually be the more reasonable Borehole win condition.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, Reaper Function, love this art. It's a hostile asset. When your turn begins, you may trash this non-unique asset to do 2 net damage. It's 2 to trash, 3 to res. So obviously a bit more favorable for the runner if they have to pull this down. But again, it's another card that you don't res until it actually does something. So you're probably not going to pay 3 credits unless it nearly wins you the game.
Yeah, and actually, as I'm looking at this, I'm like, oh, maybe I want to move this, maybe because I want to put this in faction staple eventually, because of what it does for a major deck in the faction. It's like, oh, maybe I need to reevaluate the other Jinteki card, which being killing a little bit. But like, so this fits in exactly one deck, but I think that deck is pretty solid, which is the like never advanced trap PE kind of lists.
The idea with that deck is you put out a lot of cards, you never advance them, and some of them are like snares, some of them are urticas, and then these are on the table. I do think Never Advanced Trap is like a fair bit worse than advanceable traps on the basis that they generally don't hit as hard as like, core damage or a lot more damage off the Urtica. I'm a bit dubious whether that exists. I do think, is that a Bladderwort deck? I reckon it is, right?
Yeah, it's probably a Bladderwort deck. It's probably actually also a Keeling deck. Like you put the Keeling behind some ice, and then you put other assets out wide, and you're just trying to say you've got to deal with a lot of threats all at once. I've got some stings naked on the table. And you can start setting up some really big kill turns.
Synth DNA modification, like it's very close to being a poisonous card, and I don't know whether we have the slots for that sort of thing. I do think this card is also flexible though. Whether you want to play, just about people turned out love Bladderwort, and Bladderwort is getting tournament results. I still don't understand Bladderwort. I'm not a Bladderwort gamer, but like it's still doing results, and this fits in this package. There's Weyland support for this card, and I think that also can fit into Personal Evolution. I'm actually really excited to play this in like op, because I do think you can pull this at instant speed in some board states and do some really mean stuff with this in like AZF protocol and then like a Neurospike or whatever. Like there's some fun things to do there too.
Yeah, that's true. There is a potential 6 damage combo in op there as well, which is usually where you want to start looking at damage combos. Yeah, so actually, I think maybe what I might say is I think this is probably a faction staple, but probably sort of on the weaker side of faction staples. Yeah. And I might bump Keeling actually up to the left of it.
To the left. So not that that's how we define this. I do think you're probably going to see a bit more Reaper function because it is playable out of faction. Like whether people are going to have prison NBN decks or whatever, like you still need to do a lot of work with influence to get that to be lethal. But at least Keeling, you're probably only going to see in Jinteki.
Keeling, you're probably only going to see in Jinteki. I'm not sold that you're going to see Reaper function out of Jinteki unless you've got some weird multi-faction kill set up, like with a single end of the line, and the Reaper function is what lets you kind of get there. But maybe that's what I'm missing.
Cool. Yeah, I'm fine with this. I think that's actually quite interesting. So far, the Jinteki cards have been quite good and quite powerful. They do something very unique. Speaking of something pretty unique, we have Hafren. It's nice. It costs 2 to res, 3 strength, higher strength than res cost. That's generally pretty good. It's also a barrier, but it's also a code gate. A lot of times I read the first subtype and then I stop reading because everything else is like Sentry or AP Destroyer. Like it doesn't actually matter, but this one does. And it has a single end the run subroutine, which is already not bad. But it says when you res this ice during a run against this server, you may trash a card from HQ. So same thing like Anemone. And if you do, choose 1 installed runner card. That card's abilities cannot break subroutines for the remainder of this run. So that is an interesting and powerful effect. It's worth knowing that this can be broken by both fractors and decoders. So if they have 2 on the table, you generally will just pick the one that is the most efficient at breaking this, Or, and very interestingly, you can pick something that was going to be necessary to break ice behind this during the run. So the idea is that if there's like a big old spider and an Anansi behind this, you can blank their killer. And at that point, they don't have to break this, so they just bounce off of it, and then they just kind of can come right back. So you're hoping that run was at least taxing to get to that point, I guess. I think people are really excited about this card because it has like a border control type ability. It kind of deals with endurance, but like I think that the window for this to get enough value to be worth it in your deck is so narrow and so tight that I probably would just play something that's a bit more consistent. Because having a 2-type dice, they'll just break it for 2 credits with paperclip, and then I don't know what we're doing.
Yeah, if you're familiar with the /summon command on JNet, there would be turns where going /summon half run is exactly what would win you the game. But I would say most turns you play, you're going to look at this half run and go, why is this here? This isn't taxing. It doesn't reliably end the run. And even on its use case where it blanks a card, they just spend another click and go through. So I have to squeeze every single ounce of value out of this card. And like, I think that includes I have to make use of the fact that I trashed a card from HQ.
Yeah, that's a big cost. But admittedly, there's a lot of cards that make that an upside. But like, there's so much on this thing that make it so hard to use. Yeah, I don't know. Jinteki Ice is not very good though. So like, this probably still finds slots in decks.
Oh, I don't think this does.
Oh, okay. Where do you want to put it then?
I think I might put this in shame. I think it's a little bit undertuned and a little bit over nerfed. If it was like choose a card and that card can't be used for the rest of the turn, suddenly I'm like, oh, cool. I'm finding a place for this. It's still conditional, but it's kind of cool.
I was like so excited for Jinteki to get a barrier that I stopped reading there, and I was like, this is actually a pretty good card. But then you see the code gate thing there, and maybe that's good because you can res your Ivix a bit cheaper. But like, if this was only a barrier, that's a real good card.
Yeah, no, agreed. I think if this was like a 2 strength, 2 res barrier with this text, it'd be a really good card. But being a barrier code gate just makes it so much less robust.
All right, we have one more piece of ice though, and this one's I think a fair bit more. It'll hurt you at least. This is Vampiro Nasa Codegate AP. 7 to res is a lot. 4 strength is not a lot, but has 4 subroutines, which is kind of a magical number in a world of endurance. You want a lot of subroutines more than you want strength. The runner loses 2 credits. You gain 2 credits, you do 2 net damage, and then you may draw 1 or 2 cards. And may means you can also draw 0 cards. So any option there. This thing I have face checked into like Ampere decks that obviously financially were ruined by resing this, but it is something that is genuinely a bit difficult to break. For Black Orchestra, you're paying 6 for this, which is a lot. It's a lot of subroutines. Now, I do think you can let some of these subroutines fire consistently. I do think you can probably lose 2 on this. It's cheaper than breaking it, and then you can allow probably the corporation to draw a card or 2. If they don't have money, those cards sometimes help if they draw a copy. What do you think about this one? This one's like, it's cool that there's a face check that's a code gate.
I'm reasonably high on this card. I think, yeah, face checks, penalty on code gate, like DNA Tracker was a very hated card when it was released because it broke the rules of what code gates were allowed to do. And Vampiro Nessa breaks the rules of what code gates are allowed to do in a similar fashion. Less punishing one for sure. Like you're not losing 3 cards and 6 credits when you hit this as the runner. But I think the fact that you will sometimes res this for 5, I think is actually pretty relevant.
Yeah.
Because that's an ice slot in Jinteki that's been pretty barren. Like you had Thimble Rig, and then you had DNA Tracker with only Lotus Field in between. And Lotus Field hasn't been playable since well before NSG was in the game.
Yeah, Yogg, Parasucker. It's been a while.
So like I think this does fill a really nice slot for Jinteki that want to be sort of a rushier side of Glacier decks, whereas like DNA oh my goodness, is DNA Tracker, right?
Yeah.
Oh my god, I had like is that a playtest name? Is that
yeah, DNA Tracker.
Yeah.
Still good though, and you can play that DNA Tracker over this. Like I think that's the interesting thing here. The cheap res on this, if you res it for 5, is a big difference in DNA Tracker. Albeit DNA Tracker hits harder. Now that's not always the most necessary thing on your ice.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, this giving you back tempo rather than costing the runner tempo is kind of can be a preferred thing in a rush deck. Like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, it's nice to slow down the runner, but sometimes it's like, oh no, I really need these cards or these credits. And someone pointed out, I think in the daily cast stream, that uh, like this just feeds you your next analytic void trigger. Like this is an analytic void, the runner
It's
has to
true.
break
Yeah, no,
basically everything.
that's very true, and it makes it easier for to like res half runs and anemones because you'll have like a better selection, or even play Hansei review if you overdraw with this, which obviously would be pretty sick.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we haven't said startup yet so far, but I think while this is very expensive for startup, if you res this for 5, Buzzsaw or what's it called, Unity, don't break this relatively well, barring some support. Buzzsaw actually breaks this really well once you play a Turbine, but yeah, that's actually I think pretty meaningful to get some good ice in Jinteki and startup.
No, I agree.
What do you want to do with this? This thing to me is like I don't think it's exactly a faction staple. I could be wrong on that, but it's not like this is where our ranking falls apart because it's not an archetypal thing exactly.
I see. Here's the thing: if we're going to put Bathynomus in faction staple, this is definitely a faction staple.
Oh, okay. But now we're like we're fouling because we fouled before. I still think Bathynomus is a faction staple. I'll put it there. Okay, fine. Bathynomus tax. That's fine. Okay, you want to go to the next one?
Yeah, sure.
All right, it's Simulation Reset. I love this card. Trash up to 5 cards from HQ, shuffle that many from archives into R&D, and draw that many cards. Remove this from the game. You just get a mulligan whenever you want. And even getting a mulligan in the mid game, especially when it kind of resets your deck and you put all your good stuff back and you draw a new hand, and drawing a new hand in the middle of your turn can be pretty scary, especially if HQ is not well protected. This card does so much for a single card slot, and it's technically tempo positive, which is ridiculous for a recursion card.
Or it's like slightly tempo negative because you're losing a
Yeah,
card.
okay, but
right?
it's not like
Wait.
preemptive or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not a preemptive, right? So for sure, and it does a lot more recursion than something like a Spin Doctor can do for you.
Yeah, it's the most recursion on a single card potentially.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean I think this card's just really solid. I think it's gonna get played in most Jinteki decks probably because it has uses for decks that want to just have you act as a snare a million times, and it also has room in the kind of glaciary decks where they can just go, you know what, I need to take another mulligan, I need to get my Rashidas back, my NGO fronts back,
Yeah,
I need to get back the void the runner trashed, and this 20th piece of ice, or not 20th, this 8th to 10th piece of ice isn't doing anything for me, so I'll turn that into a card I care about, hopefully.
yeah. On top of it like puts face down cards en masse. Mind you, trashing your hand, that's going to be face down, so that helps with just about all the other cards that care about face down cards. It's one of the fastest ways, barring Kakarenbo, to put face down cards in archives, which is pretty important. I think if this was any less influence than it would see a massive amount of play across the whole game. But 3 influence is a bit too high to splash.
If this was 2 influence, it would probably go in most of my HB decks as well. Like just draw 5 or draw up to 5 is just such powerful text.
Yeah, that's really, really quite good. It's strange. I don't know. Out of any faction, barring like snare recursion, I feel like Jinteki wants us the least. I think this easily could have, and it felt flavorfully like a Weyland card. You'd have to rename it. You don't want to actually kill any animals in that one directly. But yeah, potentially a very, very powerful effect. I'm a huge fan of this. I think this is a faction staple.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it's really interesting that HB ends up basically all in role player, and Jinteki's ending up in a lot of faction staple. I think again that goes to a little bit, hopefully, the design intents of the set. We'll have to see.
Yeah, and we said this before when we opened with Midnight Sun review that we said Jinteki needed the most help competitively and HB needed the least. Maybe that's reflected here. I don't know, but it's good to see. It's really good to see some exciting Jinteki cards. All right, and now finally our last Jinteki card. This is a very spicy grid. This is Nani Civic Grid. It's a region upgrade. It will limit 1 per server, and it says when the runner approaches the server, you may turn a face-down piece of ice in archives face up, and if you do, resolve 1 subroutine on that ice. And resolve means that icebreakers are not going to come into the conversation at all. It's just going to happen to you, which there's a lot of good ice, whether it's just a simple end the run or whether it's Bathynomus Faction Staples 3 net damage is now actually one of the best subroutines for this sort of thing, which is pretty cool. It's also not unique, but it's kind of expensive, or not expensive, it's a bit fiddly. There's a lot of situations where this could be a blank card if archives is respected.
Yeah, it's definitely like a really powerful card because resolving subroutines on ice is really powerful. The runner has put a bunch of effort into their deck of making sure that subroutines never fire,
Yeah.
and it says no, it's going to fire, provided you can meet all these other conditions. I think the non-unique and no restriction on where you can install it. I think there's some really interesting play patterns where if you draw two of these, you put one of them on archives and one of them on a server you care about.
Yes.
And now, if you can get enough cards face down in archives, the runner's going to be in a really tough spot because they can't even just go and do the natural counterplay of running archives to flip everything face up.
Yeah, that's one of the
Before they
servers
can
where like
challenge the
just
server.
even throwing an end the run on archives just to make sure that you can protect your other flip stuff is like not the worst. 2 credits to reses is also quite cheap. But like that gets interesting too. If you want to use archives and protect archives because you're using it as like the Regenesis pool to be able to keep an Obokata in there, which they can't steal. Mind you, if they do flip the Obokata, you turn off Regenesis anyway. So that's where an end the run might be a bit better than just doing some net damage, which admittedly protects the Obokata. You're going to run into some problems in a couple turns. But yeah, very flexible. And even just like border control and remote server, if you can go fast enough that they can't afford to check archives while also running the remote and also dealing with potentially half run. Yeah, it's scary. This thing's really scary.
No, and I think actually like half run and an enemy are great shouts for this. Where if you put those on a scoring remote, even if the runner goes and does the natural counterplay of running archives, you can say, "Oh, you got to do it again," or face whatever card I had in hand, which can be quite scary as the runner.
And while we saw most of the cards in this set and the last set inherently working, I think the best with the Jinteki net damage archetypes, this thing is like a nonsense powerful Glacier tool. And like an Ag Infusion, I think is the biggest winner by a mile, which like wants to trash his unresed cards, and then you get more of these sort of effects. Where now a face down, basically, if you want to run the Ag Infusion remote, you're always going to have to run it at least twice. No matter what. If this is
this actually this now says honestly most of the time you're probably running that server 3 times. So it's once for the Ag Infusion ability, once for the Nanocivic, right, assuming it had an end the run, and then you have to go and be ready to score it. And it's like, oh, now they just need one more end the run trigger, and suddenly it's your entire turn for not that much investment from them.
Yeah, it's nonsense powerful. And of course, all these cards at this point in Netrunner, I don't even know if it's worth saying, like dies to pinhole threading. Yeah, but admittedly, the fact that this can also have one on archives and one on the remote on like the remote server is one of the best protections to the cheesy pinhole threading. So that's cool.
Yeah,
this thing's good. This thing's really good.
Yeah, this thing's very good. I don't know if it's the. I'm like, is it the strongest? Probably not.
No. It's fiddly. Like it has states where it doesn't do anything. Like it is admittedly fiddly. I do think the ceiling is high enough to pursue it. Even the floor sometimes. Okay, wait, this is a nonsense thing to say, but the floor sometimes on dead upgrades are you can still put them in a remote server and they still look like something. Sometimes it's better than a dead ice or dead operation.
I got to second in the Continentals because my upgrades could look like other cards, so I'm never going to downplay that aspect of a card that has other redeeming qualities to it.
No, just having enough stuff to put in the remote server is sometimes like the most important thing you can do in this game. Hopefully you advance them to a couple times, so it gets even scarier in Isawak if you need it. But that's Jinteki. These cards are quite good. These are good Jinteki cards. Some of them are just net damage specific. Some of them are a bit wider than that. And it's really cool to give a bit of support to all Jinteki as opposed to just like the PE Jinteki, which kind of, when it came to Midnight Sun, felt more like, oh, I hear you like net damage. We got NBN coming up. We have an agenda. This is, I believe, Freedom of Information, a 4-2 research. It gets -1 advancement requirements for each tag the runner has. It's worth noting that now every faction has one of these like negatively scaling agendas. We saw the first one was Blood in the Water for Jinteki, so every faction gets one. It rounds up in this set, and this is NBN's. This is potentially a 0-2 agenda. If the runner has 4 tags, and getting 4 tags is actually something that happens a lot into NBN with cards like Hard Hitting News specifically. There's other ways to give a couple tags. This I'm kind of really hot on because so often when you play NBN decks is you need to have not only like when you're building a Corp deck, not only do you have to have agendas, economy, ice, all that other stuff, you need tag giving cards and then you need tag punishment cards. And this just condenses so much of what you require to put into a deck into a single slot that needs to be in the deck anyways. So worst case, it's a blank 4-2. That's actually a pretty bad worst case. Not that the NBN agendas, barring Bologna, are that exciting modernly, but the good case is absurdly good and it saves you slots.
Yeah, and even if the runner is floating one tag, like a blank 3-2 suddenly is quite playable. Like people always talk about, you can fit a blank 3-2. and it is not difficult in NBN. In standard, particularly, I think in startup this card's gonna really struggle to do a lot.
Yeah.
But in startup or in standard, this card is, I think, it's great for exactly that slot compression. I don't know that you're always going to run 3 of these, but I think if you're playing a deck and that's NBN that's about tags, you're going to definitely look at slotting 1 to 2 of these as a way to kind of boost forward a game plan.
I think it's really interesting that we have agendas that are not necessarily like jam 3 in the deck. Sometimes that happens when it comes to like how many 5/3s versus 3/2s, 4/2s. But the fact that this might just be a 2 of in some decks where you're pretty sure you're going to tag someone, but you don't want to see this in your opening hand is a pretty cool space to build into. I'm a big fan of this.
Yeah. I'll maybe just the reason I don't think you want 3 of them is also like there will be those games where it's like, oh, I have 3 in hand. The runner didn't clear their hard hitting news, so I just go install,
Win.
score 6 points.
Yeah.
But in the other games where the runner makes you work for it, and you can only really have a window to score 1 of these because it becomes a 2/2 or something, like then you just have this complete blank agenda, and you'd like to have other things in that slot instead, basically.
Do you think this is good enough?
Is my theory on why you don't play all 3, but.
So like we've seen NBN Drago decks and they're running a very different agenda suite, as few agendas as they can, all the 5/3s, and watching that deck is like not very fun competitively. It's kind of just like no one wants to score the agendas. It's like kind of not the thing that the game is about. It's just something that can slot into those decks and gives them an active way to close the game out. I'm not exactly sure because that deck doesn't really tag bury people, and if they do, they've already won.
I think that I think there's a different card in this set that those decks could slot. I think this is more for like the CTM and NEH style decks of the world.
Yep.
Freedom of information is part of a tempo game where you've convinced the runner that, or you force the runner in some way to take these tags and float them.
Cool. Where do you want to put
Draco doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Drago it's a different beast for sure. Well, what do you think about this thing? Like it's near faction stable. You're not going to see it in every NBN deck, but I think it's going to be an important part of those. To me, it kind of feels like ontological though. Like it just like tags seem more inherent to NBN than core does to HB.
Yeah, it's tricky because I think that's exactly. Yeah, I would probably put this in faction staple. I might even put it all the way to the left of Keeling.
Okay. I am still, and like, I think we're starting to see a bit different. I think the UK Nationals deck is the first time we saw that, but there's so many agendas like that are 4/2, and obviously this can be a different spot. But like, I think Artificial Crypto Crash was one like that people are just so averse of playing an agenda that is not inherently tempo positive for them, that like sometimes people just don't like to play these things. I do hope that the upside on this is strong enough. I think Crypto Crash is a bit slept on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. I think a 0/2 is so much tempo that like it's a little bit hard to ignore that upside when evaluating the card.
I'm gonna hate to score at that 4/2 though, that's for sure. All right.
Sure.
Post-truth dividend, bring your child to work day. When you score this agenda, you may draw a card. It's good that it says may, I guess. It's better than not. And it's a 2/1 agenda. NBN classically had 2/1 agendas back in 2012, going on for a while, and it still does have 1/2/1 agenda in standard 15 minutes. It's a 1F per deck. This is interesting. It's a really easy agenda to score, and NBN with this set, and also they already have cards that punish when agendas are scored or stolen, I reckon. So it's a way to push yourself forward on points while also generating some other board-based tempo in an asset deck, and that's kind of cool. This ability on its own, though, is very strange to me, because if you have 6 cards in hand after mandatory draw and you install Advances, you're going to be on 6 cards again, and you have to discard a card. Not that discarding card is the worst thing to do, but one of the worst times to draw cards is at the end of your turn, because maybe you drew another agenda and now HQ is a bit ugly. It's the same thing as like the Midnight 3 Arcology. This is just a smaller version of it, and that card saw absolutely 0 play. Obviously 2/1's different. What do you think?
So I think while yes, it's a downside if you're like, oh, my hand is full of cards I like, but if that's the situation, just
don't
opt to not draw a card.
Yeah.
If I'm playing like a fast advance style deck or a tempo style deck, like I really want every card draw I can get, because I'm playing a race against the runner. And like the thing I've already tried with this is like, oh, what if I play like Anamani Sanai and then another card that we're going to talk about shortly, and just like I'm playing a tempo game and I can score this. Now I'm going to tax the runner a little 2 credits while I go and get myself a point. And these sorts of like, it's this gradual kind of buildup of momentum and swings that eventually kind of lead you to close out the game. And as you know, as we've said a bunch, a blank 2/1 is already pretty playable, and so this is a 2/1 with a not enormous but not non-zero upside.
Yeah, you're gonna have to pay in mind what sort of agenda suite this is attached to, right? If you're running 3 Bolognas and then you're
Yeah.
running like some 2-pointers, this actually doesn't help you to win unless you score a couple of them. Admittedly, those like sort of Amani type triggers are going to be pretty relevant, but it is always worth looking at that. Whether you're running this as your 1-pointer in your mostly 3-pointers decks, I'm doubtful about that. I feel like 15 minutes is probably better for that, or even Echo Chamber. But again, I think if you're playing assets and you want that card draw, yeah, this definitely finds a slot.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Is the tricky thing is how you fit this into an agenda suite in NBN, because they've got very different NBN, or they've got very different agenda suites. If we were back in Astro era,
Yeah.
like this card would be would be like really, really good for those decks, but we're not in an Astro era at the moment.
On that note, you can play this on top of Sansan as a 1/1 agenda that draws a card, and like, yeah, that's good. You can still do something with your turn and still put things on the table. That's kind of what you want to do. That's nice.
Hey, get an Aurella, draw a
Yeah.
3/2 off the draw, and then suddenly we're cooking with gas. We got 3 points in one turn.
Yeah, you can start windmilling. It's great. What do you think about this? I think this is like a more like strangely enough, perhaps easily or more. I think people are going to be more excited to freely play this than freedom of information, but it's a less powerful ability overall.
Yeah, I feel like this one I feel more comfortable putting at the top of archetype role player.
Yeah, it's weird how that
Maybe
is.
that's too low.
It's a 2/1, right?
But,
Like 2/1s are good.
yeah.
I'm gonna put it here, maybe.
It's like
Maybe.
yeah, I think that's fine. It's like a 2/1. The problem is like it just doesn't fit with NBN decks that exist right now.
Yes.
And it's hard. But it's not quite good enough to make bring new decks into existence, which I don't think is quite true of Freedom of Information, which does fit in decks that already exist.
Yeah, good
and
decks.
is a high value payoff.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it opens up more slots in that deck potentially, which is good because then they can do even more stuff to further game plans in different ways. This is just like it's good. It's good, but it's not reinventing anything.
Yeah.
Speaking about reinventing anything, this is a good card. It's Gaslight. It costs nothing. It costs 1 influence. It costs 2 to trash, and it says when your turn begins, you may trash this asset. If you do, search R&D for an operation. You show it to your to the runner, and you add it to your hand. And that is just kind of a good enough ability on a card. Runners always have to trash this. Do you agree that runners always have to trash this if they see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, you just have to trash
I
it.
mean, if your opponent is playing this, it's because they're playing high value operations, and operations tend to be some of the most like impactful individual cards because they only get played once, right? So
yes,
they're usually pretty core.
So,
I think you don't play this if all of the operations in your deck are economy.
I think you still might be able to,
like
but I think you need a deck that's really jammy. Because I think if a runner runs into, it's like one of those cards that's like pseudo Rashida. Obviously, it's like in some ways it's actually kind of comparable to Rashida. It's not nowhere near as powerful, but it's actually one of the best things to put in a remote server that's not an agenda that's not Rashida. And so if you can force the issue with like a seamless launch deck, I feel like this is actually pretty okay.
yeah, I mean, I think it's the like if I gaslight for a hedge fund, I'm not sure it's giving me quite enough value to really feel like I've earned the slot always. But if it's using up my scoring remote and I'm saying, oh, instead of getting Rashida, I got a hedge fund, that's definitely not a non-zero amount of power. That said, I expect to see this card like everywhere.
Yeah.
Because there's so many powerful operations and so many like faction and game defining operations that people can play. And then this also has this role of like, hey, if I need a certain tech operation, something like a best defense or a trust operation or
Escape
net.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Like I can just have one of in my deck. I can run more gaslights than that. Or I can just run one gaslight and one scape net, and then my gaslight can get me other stuff in matchups where that's relevant or the specific tool. So no, I am super high on this card.
Yeah. And like, you know, the ability to pull up your one of Neurospike and like weird op lists. Like there's just so much you can imagine with this thing. Admittedly, it might not be consistent. They have to not trash it. If you trade a click for their click and 2 credits and they have to get through a piece of ice, that's generally a winning proposition for you. Yeah, I think this is huge. And the fact that it can open up deck building in a very meaningful way is huge. It's 1 influence. Every faction has a reason to consider this.
Yeah, no, as the just to shout out the process who did in their spoilers podcast, like they had this card and they were like, Yeah, this card's just going to be silently enabling all of the best decks in on the Corp side for a while.
Yep.
And I think that's probably true.
And that's the big thing now. Like you played Netrunner maybe for a couple years playing standard. What's in the remote server? Firstly, is it an agenda? Okay. Is it Rashida? And now this is now going to be the third thing that enters that conversation. And if they can draw their best operation in their deck on this turn, how bad is that? Are you going to have to pinhole threading these things? Are you going to have to like, I don't know. This is a good enough target that you would consider hitting with what's it called? Political operative if that was back in standard. Like it's potentially a very powerful ability.
Sure.
I don't know if this is banned me because I think like it's one of the cards that we've seen today that's closest to that, but I'm not sure if it's exactly there.
I think so. I think in part of our mission of diffusing out the ratings to give them a little bit more visual, I think we can put this comfortably in ban me. I don't think it's really going to get banned, but I think it's going to be in a bunch of decks that are like investigated by the SBL,
Yes,
or SBT, whatever that's called.
And I don't know how clear we were about this, but when we say ban me, we don't actually mean these cards should be banned. They're just like the most powerful cards that I think could engender those conversations more than like this needs to go. The game's not in a good spot.
Yeah.
All right. This art's really fun. This is Vera. Asset executive. Whenever an agenda is scored or stolen, you may reveal the grip. Trash one card revealed this way. Of course, this has to be rezzed for this ability to be online. So the last time you can res a card, if the runner's hitting R&D HQ, or in the best case scenario, the remote server that you know the agenda's in, is you have to res it right after or at the same time they commit to access. So you can't, run R&D. Oh, it's an agenda. Let me res this. So that's always worth noting. But this is the second card like Amani Sanai. That gives you tempo that does some sort of damage that puts the opponent back when they steal or when you score. So either it's win more or in some ways lose less. And it's good that has that flexibility. What do you think about this?
I think this card's really, it's fun. I think it's the first thing I'm going to say.
Yeah.
Like it is, I've gotten to play with it and it's like, oh, I get to snipe a deep dive out of your hand.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I get to snipe like, oh, you're on no credits. Let's get rid of that dirty laundry in your hand. Like, because you get to choose the card, you always get to take the best card out of the runner's hand, which is like can be really game changing. At the same time, it's got lots of downsides. Like it's pretty expensive.
Yes.
And if you're resing it on an unknown trigger, like they're running R&D and you have no idea, or you're running it on an HQ run that's a 1 in 5, you feel like that can be a really large economic penalty.
It can be quite expensive.
And then there's also gonna be those times where you're playing up against an Anarch player and you look at their hand and you go, oh, you've got 2 bin breakers and a steel skin. Can I discard none of these, please?
Yeah.
Like there's just, or there's going to be hands where like you're so far behind that resing this does nothing for you. Like, okay, yeah, I can get rid of the best possible card in the runner's hand, and I'm still losing, and this does nothing.
It's worth mentioning that looking at the grip, like it's unfortunate that this is actually anti-synergistic, but there's an archetype about getting full information of the runner's hands with things like focus group. But the fact that you're actually removing a card makes this harder to connect. I don't think you're going to play this with that complete image Jinteki kill. But looking at the hand is technically valuable as long as you can act on that information.
Actually, I know you say this. It doesn't have a 0 synergy with focus group though. Like if you can set up that like a Rela Sansan server, suddenly you score one thing and then you can focus group with something else that turn. I think it's just probably a little bit the thing I've been enjoying. My theory behind this was like, oh, I could play this and Amani. The runner runs, they steal a 3-2 or a 3-1.
Yeah, and you pinball
and then I get to bounce their boat. Exactly. I pinball their boat into their hand, then knock it into the trash as a nice 1-2.
Good old snooker trick shots. It's gonna be really fun when that lands. But yeah,
I also probably some people are screaming PE 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 because this is also a PE card.
Yeah, that's true.
Because you can trigger this. It's 4 influence, so it's expensive to bring in PE, but that almost seems like a better home for it to me than NBN because this just adds a damage basically to every agenda score or steal.
And there's so many cards that not secretly, I'll talk about it in op decks. There's like op combo decks where this is another piece to it. Again, like Azief into Neurospike, if you can pull it at instant speed, like you can do some pretty wild stuff, I reckon. I do think, right, like we said, this the Mani Sanai difference is the Mani Sanai sometimes shows up as a 3 of in decks because impacting the board state, especially with like the 8 cost cards like Endurance being everywhere, can blow out the game, and she is nothing to res and she's a lot to trash. And this is harder. You have to more consider this. Um, but I think the biggest flaw for this potentially is in asset-based decks that are weak to things like Deep Dive or weak to things like Apocalypse. This is something that you're going to have to learn to play around, and it's difficult to play around. It's kind of like the hostile infrastructure of yore, where if this is secretly on the board during a Deep Dive setup, or if they score out that 2-1 post-truth thing, they can disrupt your entire game plan if you're just holding on to a Deep Dive or an Apocalypse. And it's worth considering if that becomes too big of a part of the meta.
Yeah, no, I really like that point about how this does actually help with some of the asset deck's natural predators of Deep Dive and Apocalypse.
No, this card's cool. Also, Mauricio doing art again for Netrunner is sick. Where do you want to put this thing?
It's such a nice piece. I feel like fairly high in archetype role player.
Yeah.
Behind
that?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, no, it's good. It's good. And I do think people are going to play it. And I do think it's going to get some pretty bad blowouts, but I think it's a bit harder to play than the Amanis we're used to. So we got another NBN. This is a piece of ice, and there's 2 ice that have this reoccurring kind of on encounter text, or when you res, excuse me, text. And this is Klevetnik. 3 cost, 3 strength barrier with a single end run subroutine is not the worst. While static was a card back in the day. But this is when you res this ice during a run against the server, you may have the runner gain 2 credits. If you do, choose an installed resource, and that resource loses all abilities until your next turn ends. Firstly, your next turn is the Corp's turn, so this will last for a whole turn, and it's not when your next turn end, it's when your next turn ends. So it'll be for a whole runner turn and then a whole more Corp turn, right? Well, I guess you're generally resing this on the runner's turn, so their turn and then your turn. Something like that. Yeah,
you basically get 1 turn where you have a full 3 set of actions that you can take to exploit the fact that you've blanked 1 runner resource.
Yes. This thing is weird.
Yeah. It is very, very weird. And I think I really like when I can look at this card and then I can look at ping and I go, how often does this do more for me than ping? And the answer is
nearly never.
Maybe never. I like the one case I've heard pitched is like, oh, the runner has a Citadel Sanctuary on the board.
And so you've already res the ping. Yeah.
And you blank the Citadel Sanctuary, and then you have some way of guaranteed landing a kill combo. And I'm like, well, let's get to that kill combo first, and then we can deal with the rest of this later. And I just like this card doesn't make a ton of sense to me. Maybe it's a card for startup, but I suspect that ping just kind of displaces it even in something like startup.
Yeah. So that's the big question. Like, what resource are you blanking? I do think there's some chance that blanking no free lunch. And again, not because they have a tag now, but because you can give a tag on your turn, either with a Drago that's brewing or with a, what's it called? The HB card that gives a tag. That sort of thing can be potential. Like, we're getting a single tag actually matters because you can blank their anti-tag tech. Now, again, if they have 2 of them, if they have another way to deal with it, if they have a tag already during their turn, they can just clear the tag unless they run into this last click. And again, it's on to you. It's up to you to res it at a point that it's meaningful. Hopefully it's meaningful. But on top of that, the elephant in the room here, and this kind of to me suggests that future design space, the fact that this NBN Ice and then the next NBN Ice also, like, their on-res ability cost is not to discard a card from hand, which classically Jinteki is now using as an upside in a lot of cases, is to give the runner credits. We've seen that on 3 cards in this set, and there's no support for why giving the runner credits would actually be like a bad thing. So I'm convinced that the next NBN set we're going to see in the future actually cares about that. And it's going to be something like reverse game net. Whenever the runner gains credits on their turn, gain the same amount of credits. Like, something like that has to exist here, because that is an absurd cost attached to any of this stuff.
Yeah, no, it's a quite high cost, and that's like, it's hard to think about decks because giving your opponent money is often basically as bad as spending your own. Sometimes even worse.
Yeah, often worse, unless they have infinite money, and when then it's not a real cost. But at that point, you're in a bad spot regardless. So
yeah, it's like the times when you don't care about giving your opponent 2 credits are probably spots you're not doing well in. Or there's spots you've won. I mean, like, maybe that's the idea. Is like, oh, hey, I'm just playing all gear checks, and like all I care about is did you find your breaker. Now the problem is we're in a terrible meta for that. Yeah. So it's a bit of a mismatch.
Yep, this thing is a huge question mark of future design space. Inherently, like there's no resource. I think I'm really excited. As soon as there's a resource in the meta where blanking it can be disastrous, like losing immense hand size with Bagbiter, like effects like that. And obviously, Bagbiter is not a thing, let alone wasn't ever a thing. But if there is something where this lines up, this immediately can become important. But like right now, this is the bottom of the bin for me.
Yeah, that's a great point. Is like, yeah, this could exist for those kind of ongoing effects, but yeah, there's no other place this card could go.
Yeah. Okay. Now, similar in some ways, Unsmiling Serena, Sentry AP, 4 to res, 3 Sabretines, 2 strength. That's not the worst. And same idea, when you res this, you can just hand over money. It's not your money, it's money from the bank, but you're giving somebody money. And if you do, the runner cannot break more than 1 of the Sabretines on this card. And this card has 3 Sabretines, all of which are actually kind of cool. First one's give the runner a tag. Second is do 2 net damage. And thirdly, you may draw 2 cards. It's weird how this is worded. Oh, because it's only 2. It's not 0, 1, or 2. It's 0 or 2. So it's technically a bit more strict than the Vampirinessa. This is a good sentry in NBN. And NBN, barring Turnpike, which has just been holding that whole faction afloat in standard for centuries, like, is this better than Turnpike? It could be. Yeah, honestly, it could be.
Yeah, I'm trying it instead of Turnpike just to see how it feels.
Yeah.
Because I don't have a strong sense. Like, this has some stronger upsides than Turnpike, and it's got some downsides in that it is twice the cost with a less reliable tag, though not. I mean, I don't know if the runners like Turnpike people will just run through sometimes when maybe they shouldn't, and I don't think anyone's gonna run through an Unsmiling Tsarevna when they shouldn't. They're gonna go, oh, I really shouldn't do this. But
that's a big thing, is that people face check into NBN without having a killer. It's unlike Jinteki, to some extent. It's unlike HB. People will face check in this, which means that not only are you less incentivized to pay the 2 credits, barring a boat, and at that point you could consider it. This actually probably connects a bit more than you'd expect in faction.
Yeah, and I guess it's interesting to think like, okay, if I spend 6 to res this, I make the runner break a subroutine. Am I happy dealing 2 net and drawing 2 cards, or dealing 2 net and giving a tag? Seems a little pricey for that effect, but I think there's going to be a lot of games where you don't have to give the runner 2. They're just going to face check, and then this ice looks really nice. So,
and even out of faction for 2 influence, like, I don't think I want to play this while it says Jinteki. I don't think I'm that excited to play it. Sorry, while it says net damage, I don't think I'm that excited to play it in Jinteki, because people are generally running after they install their killers. But something like Weyland, where again the sentry face checks are not that they're kind of few and far between, and they're usually program based stuff. But this, if you're playing some sort of end of the line net damage, tag, kill, like all that sort of stuff together in one package, meat damage, that's a good old face check. That's good. And all of these subroutines are actually very good subroutines in an Argus deck that existed 4 years ago.
Yeah, that's actually a really nice point. Is like, this kind of it's not going to be Data Raven, because Data Raven was such a unique card.
Yeah.
But this does actually have some similarities to what you were importing Data Raven for, and is that coming in at the same influence budget. So it's a nice shout for it.
Yeah, like if they run the remote server and can only break 1 of these subroutines, which one do you break? Like, there's a lot of Weyland type kill decks that actually can make that a very hard choice. And I like that a lot.
Yeah. Pretty cool.
All right.
It's a nice shout. I hadn't thought of it.
Where does this go? Yeah, 2 influence. You can put this anywhere if you really wanted to.
I think this is probably an archetype. I mean, like, this is an archetype role player to me, or maybe it should go up with Vampirinessa. Like, it's maybe one of those. It's one of those 2.
I would put it a bit above. I think it's more playable than Vampirinessa widely.
I think that's pretty good. Yeah, I think it would maybe only go in archetype role player because NBN does have a lot of good ice and Jinteki doesn't.
Yeah.
But I think this is probably the right spot for it.
Awesome. We got 2 more NBN cards. This one is non-equivalent exchange transaction operation. Oh, Weyland, building a better world, smiles. You gain 3 credits when you play this. It's gain 5, cost 2, but you may have each player gain 2 credits. When I first read this is obviously support for multiplayer. Like we can play 4 players or whatever. But the idea here is that you can make this be a 7 credit gain for yourself, a 5 credit gain, while also giving the runner 2 credits. So we've seen cards like this. Classically, Jinteki had Medical Fundraiser. What was it called? Something like that?
Medical Research Fundraiser.
That sounds right. Yeah. Which is a very similar card. You got way more money than you'd expect for an operation that you can play on 2 credits on nearly every board state, but you gave the runner a bit of money as well. And again, this is the 3rd card that gives the runner 2 credits, and I'm assuming there's going to be support in the future for that.
This card's, that tiny bit more powerful than Medical Research Fundraiser, but Medical Research Fundraiser saw no play.
It saw
So
play in Jinteki trap decks where it's a sort of deck where economy was not the crux. It was not the focus of the deck, right? It was more about like, can you run the right traps? Can you keep enough cards in hand? Can you not get flatlined? So giving the runner 3 credits in that matchup was not a big cost, but it's not something you would see in like Jinteki mid-range Glacier, that's for sure.
maybe you could play this then in the trappy Proptivost lists, where you're just
Yeah.
like
If you go full
throwing
traps,
down like, yeah, if you're just throwing down Dragos and Cheka Scions and Vigs and Cerebrals and like just saying, yeah, money's not as important. I need to have enough money to fire all my traps and res my annoying ice, but I don't care that much about how much money you have.
I'm glad you brought that up because what we've seen out of the Jinteki and the HB side is such a like a call and response to Midnight Sun, and the NBN stuff to me feels so far removed from Vladisibirsk, or not Vladisibirsk, excuse me, from
Yeah.
Proptivost, right? Like none of these cards I think I would very excitedly play in my Proptivost deck, and I don't know what's with that.
Yeah.
It's weird. But yeah, Proptivost, like
it is very divorced from the two.
yeah, one of the best things in Proptivost competitively is NAPD Cordon, and for that reason, I don't think I want to play this. So you have to play a very specific Proptivost deck on top of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is a card in search of a home, I think, at the moment.
Yeah, yeah. On its own, like shows up in impaired decks, that's for sure. Being able to play this
I
credit.
was actually just about to throw to that. I was like, well, technically, there is one more corp that definitely is going to play this now.
We have like a really good low shelf now for any card that's like not good enough for standard decks. It's like, oh, impaired definitely plays this, but yeah, that's not really a good thing to compare it to. Yeah, it's weird. Like giving the runner credits is not what you want to do in an NBN asset deck because that's generally about making sure they don't have money so they can't deal with your board and leverage like hard hitting news credit differentials. NBN Glacier, obviously not a thing you want to do in that mistake in that game plan. Can you just play a 3 credit econ card in your deck if you're not using any of the text on this card, and then you definitely play planogram before this 3 times over? So it's a bit of a mystery. I really do think the gain 2 credits for the runner thing is going to make this very interesting sometime in the future where hopefully that matters.
Yeah. Yeah. I think up until that point, this is probably shame, but
yeah, kind of. Like how much influence is this thing? It's 2 influence too. Like if it's 1 influence, you could have this as a panic econ card, as one of the best econ cards in like a financially absolutely non-solvent corporation deck. But 2 influence, like again, planogram for 1.
Yeah, I mean, it would be transaction support for building a better world, but
yeah, no thanks.
But it would have to be 1 influence for that. So I think this probably sees play before Klevetnik because it is at the very least an economy card.
Yeah,
so
and you do need those. Klevetnik, I think there's better things that do that. Economy is important. Last NBN card though, and this is a banger. Shipment from Vladisibirsk. Gray Ops operation. Play only if the runner has at least 2 tags. So the boom clause, we know we can give the runner 2 tags. Boom is played. Place a total of 4 advancement counters on installed cards that you can advance. Don't look at the crates. This is actually, I think, the only pseudo Proptivost card, but it's no, I don't even know if this is the best card in Proptivost by a mile.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a Proptivost card, but I think this is a really nice operation for good. NBN. I think one thing we're going to see is like the obvious question, and that you kind of alluded to it, is like, why not just play Boom? And I think the answer is we're going to see a lot of runners really teched out for damage. If I had to make my guess as to what the Parhelion meta is going to shake out to, and so Shipment from Vladisibirsk says, well, if the runner's teched out for damage, they probably have not teched out for me just scoring out. It's hard to tech for all these things simultaneously.
Yeah.
And the game NBN is made, so they will eventually end up in a scenario where this card text is active, and so now I have a payoff of I can score it below it from hand for 2 credits. And my whole turn.
And Boom is a fair bit of influence. It's also a bit fiddly. It can be trashed. And this is a tag punishment card that is very like slot compressed. So the closest card to this is Psychographics. And Psychographics cost X, where X is the amount of tags the runner has to place that many advancements on a single card. So a lot of times when I play Psychographics decks, I'm playing them in horizontal acid-based decks. And there's usually this turning point where you spend a lot of money to give the runner 4 tags with hard-hitting news. And at that point, they decide to go tag me. That means they can trash a lot of your assets with impunity, which is where all your economy is tied into. So you find yourself in a situation where you have access to Psychographics and maybe that mythical Project Beal, but you don't have the credits to close the game out. This is so much better than psychographics in any squeaky deck that like can just barely get you the tags and can just barely get to the finish line. There's so often NBN tag decks get to that tag point and just barely lose the game. And this is such a huge difference where you can use this to score like multiple freedom of informations in a single turn, let alone you can do some 5/3s from hand for 2 credits. Like that's good.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think this is a really, really nice payoff card for NBN.
I don't think
Just-
you play psychographics anymore. This is better.
I think you could still play psychographics Beal. I think that's still justifiable because like I have had a game now where the runner went to like
13.
20 tags and it's like, oh shoot, just drawing a Haas-Bioroid, I can still lose even if I fire the Haas-Bioroid, where if I draw Beal and Psycho, I'm never gonna lose. So there's some difference in which board states they're really good in, I think. I think this is slightly worse when the runner goes full tag me.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, if they go slightly tag me, this is the sweet spot. And while we did mention Pravdivos, it's good that you can divide the agenda counters here. So if you only are scoring out a Beal as a 3/2 for some reason, or any other 3/2, you can get additional advancements on like some of your ice. Or I don't think you're playing Ubiquitous Vig, but it allows you to not lose value in that deck, which is it's cute. It's not bad.
Yeah, it's a nice little gimme for that style of deck.
But yeah, no, I think this is good. I think this is as good as psychographics. It's very comparable, and that's not a very popular card, but it's a card that's shown up in competitive lists since it's come out, and it's something you have to play around now. And I think you have to play around it a bit more.
Yeah, I think when this card was first announced, I was thinking, yeah, I'm probably still playing psychographics, and I think the more I've heard people talk about it, I'm like, yeah, it's probably a little better than psychographics. This is, or not even a little, like it's probably just better.
Yeah, this is also big in startup where like there's no more 5/3 NBN agendas. So like that 4 advancements for 1 credit, 1 click is like great. That's really, really good.
Yeah, for sure.
Where do you want to put it?
I would say maybe to me, this is right by freedom of information because I think they're more or less the same idea.
I think it's better. And I think you'll see decks with this without freedom of information.
I agree. Yes,
because it's legitimate tag punishment. Like even in Weyland, if you want to do, you know, what's it called, trash your board with mutually assured destruction, and you don't want to play boom or end of the line, like it's 3 influence, but it's I think a better end game maybe than psychographics. You don't have Beal in faction, so why not?
Yeah.
Okay, what do you think about NBN as a whole? Because again, the whole like divorced from Pravdivos is like really throwing me for a loop here. It looks like there's a support for something that doesn't exist.
To me, there's a support for CTM. Like it's and so it's like, yeah, Pravdivos was like a diversion of NBN into let's try something new. And then this was a bit of a recalibration to, you know what, let's go back and give like a swan song to one of the I'm going to say most discussed identities in the history of Netrunner.
Yeah.
And it's not like these cards will be irrelevant, assuming that tags are, you know, giving the runner lots of tags remain an integral part of NBN's faction long term. So
cool. Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think we're going to see a bit more controlling the message. And again, people are playing more tag tech, so we'll see how that balances out. But at least none of this stuff is like single tag feast or famine. It's about getting those sort of board states where like a hard hitting news gets you into trouble, not like Drago. And I'd like to see less Drago, that's for sure.
Yeah, I actually, so before we move on, like this is the card I think that those Drago decks could think about running because it actually solves one of the ways that they lose, which is like, oh, I can sort of stick a Drago, but I can't win with the Drago. And so now if I can advance Drago a bunch.
Yeah, you can close the game out.
Which like, but it was a thing that happened. Like against good players, they just be like, okay, I'm going to hold a stone-shaped chart room so you can't boom me. And it's like, okay, so now my game plan becomes just, you know, a bunch of counters on the Drago for a really big market forces swing. Well, now you have a secondary option to actually just kind of clear out your hand of agendas and start advancing towards a win.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I'm very interested to see where this goes. All right, we have one more faction. This is Weyland, and we got some pretty spicy Weyland cards. They're out for some stuff. There's 2 archetypes here largely, and the first one is all about bad publicity. Regulatory capture is a 6/2 agenda. That's obviously not a good combination of numbers. You got your feet up on a desk, so it's classic Weyland. And it says for each bad publicity you have up to 4, this agenda gets -1 advancement requirement. So this rounds out the scaling agenda suite. Weyland cares about bad pub, but this has a floor. This can only be a 2/2 agenda. The designers at Null Signal Games didn't want to let this to be a 0/2 agenda, which is something that's alive and well in every other faction. If you ask me whether that's necessary or not, I'm honestly not sure. I guess it's probably reasonable. There has to be like their guardrails on here seem to be well thought out. I can't. It's hard to imagine why this deck would be that strong.
I think the thing that's different about the guardrails on regulatory capture,
Yeah.
is that bad publicity is entirely controlled by the corporation player.
Yes, that's a
The
good
runner
point.
has almost no control over the ability of the corp to gain bad publicity other than not running their illicit ice.
Yep.
Which is a very different dynamic than taking core damage, giving tags, and having cards in hand, which is the other parts of this cycle. So if I had to guess, the reason this has a limit that the other ones don't is probably related to the fact that this one has much more control by the corp, and so had some either in testing had actual design flags or just as a precautionary measure against
Yeah.
future possible states.
I think that tracks. That's a very good way of thinking about it, that it's kind of not up to you. On that note, how much bad pub do you need to expect to get in any game for this to be good? Obviously, 4 is the best at a 2-2. Even just getting 3 bad publicity, making this a 3-2 is, a lot of those Weyland decks can fast advance really well. We have access to Audacity, let alone whatever else you want to put into fast advance.
Yeah, I think your plan is to always score one of these as a 2-2.
Mm-hmm.
But you can definitely score some of them as 3-2s on your way.
Yeah.
You're never scoring this as a 4-2. You're never scoring this as a 5-2. But like the outfit fast advance deck now doesn't have to spend any influence on fast advance. It can score 7 points with just in faction tools now.
Yes.
Which means you can do anything else with the rest of your influence, which might very well mean you can do a fast advance deck that's got hard hitting news in it again.
Yep. And like the outfit's probably the big home here. We can talk about after whether you think this can fit anywhere else besides the outfit, but the outfit gains 3 credits whenever they take on a bad publicity. So this is a 2-2 agenda that kind of is assuming that you've already got 12 credits, kind of for free, doing the thing you want to do anyways. And we've talked about how things like Tule are kind of difficult because they have a game plan, but also they don't have economy attached to that. So they have to kind of do 2 things, but that's the beauty of the outfit. It's like everything all at once. Admittedly, bad publicity is inherently a downside as opposed to core damage, which is meant to be an upside for the corp and a downside for the runner. So your mileage may vary, but that's always really exciting where you can build a deck and not have to worry too much about economy.
Yeah, I think that the thing that is nice about this in outfit is the outfit it's the self-feedback loop where as you take more bad pub, you make more money, which then makes this agenda faster and faster to score. So your deck is just speeding up as you continue to play. And at some point, that bad pub will catch up to you and everything will come crashing to the ground. But hopefully you've gotten to 7 points by then. Or the runners walked into become the headline of a news story.
Yes.
And you're all set there.
Yeah,
so
this is one of the decks that I'm most excited to build in now the Parhelion world. This is obviously very comparable to Ontological. It's very comparable to the NBN one. I do think inherently it's more niche. Like we talked about, Ontological can see play outside of just Tule. We talked about how the NBN deck can see play in like Near Earth Hub and controlling the message and probably some other stuff too. But this is probably to me outfit or bust.
I agree. I think you can't take a lot of bad pub out of any of the other Weyland decks at the moment. That said, I think this is probably stronger to me than giving I think you're going to more reliably get this than you're going to give the runners, for example, 2 core damage.
I agree. I definitely agree. Whether that makes it the top of archetype role player or the bottom of faction staple, I just feel like it can't be a faction. Well, actually, it could be a faction staple.
No.
Yeah.
I don't think outfit can define the Weyland faction anymore.
But what are the good Weyland decks? It's just Ob or outfit, right? Like, is there anything else?
Well, so I think Weyland is basically the op faction, at least for the next 6 months and for the last 6 months, honestly. So
it's cool to see at least outfit maybe see some play, and I do think the outfit deck looks quite good.
I'm a big op lover, so I'm not going to complain, but I suspect next set we'll see a little less op love. So.
Okay. Now, this is maybe the midpoint between the op and outfit if you look at the Venn diagram, and that's Kimberlite Field. It's a 4-2 agenda. When you score this, you can trash one of your cards. You can make it a blank 4-2 if you want. It's a bit different than Azyef. It says if you do, trash one installed runner card with a printed install cost that's equal or less, a bit different than op, than the card that you just trashed. This, to me, has big old crypto crash energy all over it, where it's potentially ruinous. And there are so many board states where if there's something in their remote server, install advance, install double advance, it's going to change how you play the game. Because if you're playing a criminal deck and you have one of the killer, one of the fractor, whatever program, whatever resource that's really important, I think programs are the big one here. you just lose it. You just lose it, and then they get their op value, which makes this a cost, kind of a null cost, and gives them some flexibility, and then you're kind of out of the game trying to play without Begulter. Is this going to be popular enough that people are going to start not playing one of killers in their deck? I think there's a bunch of reasons why that's the case in this set. I don't think it's going to come to it. I worry that people are not going to play this card because it seems scary for the corporation, and it's not fast advance, and it's not off-world office. But I think this is just a monstrously powerful effect that, if it is in the meta, changes how people play or build decks even.
Hey, maybe it's time for Crims to start slotting a one of Reclaim again.
Yeah. Or the Heart and just like draw good. I don't know.
Yeah. But no, I think that's a good point. I like the shout out because I don't think op is like, you're not in outfit, you're not going to sink a boat with Kimberlite Field.
Yeah, you are.
Maybe if you're splashing.
Yeah, you're playing
Bulwark. Are you
Bulwark.
splashing for a toll booth or
a Bulwark? It's perfect, and it's 10 cost, and it gives you bad pub, and that's good. It's a good face check, and then if they don't have.
Sorry, in outfit for sure.
Oh, in op. Yeah, excuse me. In op, are you sinking a boat? Definitely not. But you're sinking a program. You're sinking a Wake implant. You're sinking Zenith. You're sinking good stuff. But programs a lot of times.
No. Yeah, and op does want to trigger its ID a lot. But yeah, in outfit, you can sink anything you want because you've got high res cards. And the nice thing is, often, especially in the outfit deck that's taking a lot of bad publicity, like, hey, my ice just stops mattering after a certain number of turns, so why not throw it away and chuck something off the runner's board as I do it? So I don't know. I'm
terrified about this, but I know people are not going to play it.
I don't think it's going to get played, but it's a really powerful effect, which I think is a really cool space. Like I like that Null Signal is being adventurous with 4/2s.
Yeah. No, this is. I think it's like up to us. It's like up to somebody to start pushing this in play, just so people have to start respecting it. And then I don't know. People haven't been burned out by Crypto Crash enough to be scared of it. Maybe it's just me, but it's the same kind of idea that it's hard to see play because it challenges the other good slots, but it's a really good effect. Where are we putting it?
I think you could either put it in niche, or you could put it around Jupstad grid. I think both of those are pretty reasonable takes. I have to do some real thinking about. I think I'm actually leaning into the niche box.
Oh no, I think it's good. I think it's very good, and I think it is. So I think the archetype here is you run 3 SDS drone deployment. You run 3 of this. And I think there's a lot of decks, barring Anarch. You have to do some sort of arc lockdown stuff for Anarch or Simulchip, but I think that is a deck. Trojan Horse is still a card nobody plays. I think that's a real archetype.
So you just lean into Then I would say to the right of Isawak or left of Isawak. Probably the right of Isawak, I think, is pretty reasonable.
Okay, that's fine. That feels a bit generous. Awesome. We moved the cameras because we were encroaching upon board space, but our next Weyland card here is Hostile Architecture. This is a unique hostile subtype. Couldn't have it any other way. 5 to res, 4 to trash cost, big numbers both sides, 3 influence, and the first time the runner trashes an installed card, you get to do 2 meat damage, and that includes the text on this card itself. So it is self-protecting if it's the only card going down this turn. This card mimics hostile infrastructure. That was a very potent and powerful card, but I do think a big part of that card was the way that it interacted with Apocalypse, the way that it also protected cards in central servers. It interacted with Stargate. It did a lot of good stuff because it protected all cards, not just installed cards. But I think on average, while it's unique, it's not going to scale out to nightmarish extents. I do think that this is probably a good enough piece of that sort of Bladderwort anti-tempo asset type of decks, albeit very expensive. I'm not honestly sure where to play this, and I think the first place I want to put is probably Personal Evolution, which is kind of weird.
Yeah, I think PE is the first deck that you can easily just go and slot this in. And again, it's kind of support for that never advanced PE style list.
Yeah.
And this board, I'm just that imagined board state where it's oh yeah, I've got a Keeling behind an anemone and a Hostile Architecture on the board and a Reaper function somewhere in my 3 face down remotes is that is a tough puzzle for the runner to crack.
But as soon as you spell it, all those cards, how are you going to get the 15 credits need to res it or whatever that is comes to? That is the biggest problem I have, because they're not going to let you keep the Bladderworts on the table.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, that is the challenge. I guess to some extent that has some nice Bladderwort synergy where if you have 6 credits, you can res both of them and then make a credit. And now you're pinging for a net. And then when the runner tries to interact, you're pinging them for 2 more. So I think that is a reason to naturally put this in something like PE.
Yeah.
I think maybe the other place you could look at this is something like Op, where you use this to help protect assets, and the idea is that you can use that damage to convert to end of the line kills on tempo with like a Drago or something like that.
Yeah.
Um,
It's like the sort of deck, and I love Acid Op, but you know they run Urban Renewal as like a kill combo window. They have Aziev Protocol, Fast Events as a kill combo window, and this kind of adds to that. It's just like that deck is kind of slow to spin up, and it has like the first hump to get over is like, can you get board control? And as soon as you get board control, then you're really playing the deck, and then you're pushing things into remote servers. But like this is kind of a dead card in the opening couple turns. You can't pay 5 credits to do 2 meat damage in that deck. It does not win off of that.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, and so it's definitely tricky to find its place outside of that kind of Vision PE deck. When streaming, I was building a CTM list. People were like, throw this in CTM, throw this in CTM. I'm like, I don't think this gets respected in CTM. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Maybe the 2 meat damage is there, but I feel like a lot of people just say, well, I guess I'm just not going to trash CTM assets until I have to. But when I do, it just costs me 2 cards.
Yeah,
And
it's like Bladder Word all
I'm
over
more
again.
worried about the tag than the cards.
Yeah.
So
No, I undervalue Bladderwort based off of how it's actually working. I think how competitively it's worked out. I do think Bladderwort is a card that's also like really ripe for players to misplay into it. It's just kind of hard to evaluate those two things, whether trashing this is right, whether taking the net damage is right on certain board states. And I think this is kind of a very similar card, albeit a much harder to use than just about any deck than just like putting 3 Bladderworts.
yeah, for sure. No, I do think a lot of Bladderwort's strength is that people do misplay around it quite a bit.
Yeah.
And this is probably a card that people will misplay about, but it is much harder. Like, it costs 5, not 1. So it's much easier to misplay yourself
Yeah.
and become the hoist yourself on your own petard.
Yeah, for real. I don't know where to put this because like it definitely supports an archetype of sorts. I don't think you can just slot into every acid-based deck. I think you have to do something a bit more specialized. Acids plus damage have to matter. And you mentioned end of the line, and I think that's a big part here where this like opens people up for an end of the line kill with public trail, with credit differentials, or with the I keep forgetting the name of the HB card that tags people. But like the biggest issue to me is I do not evaluate end of the line high in this modern meta just because there's so much single tech removal. So not the best thing to do now, but I could imagine a meta where that's actually a really strong win con.
So to me, this is probably still gives enough life to the PE decks, and then neither of us really saw the asset op decks, and I would not be surprised if we're misevaluating the asset op decks again.
Me too.
So to me, archetype role player, and I might put a little bit above the harmonics.
Okay. Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Yeah,
that sounds fine. Yeah, we can again. We'll have to look at this once we get through the next like 6 or so cards. But I'm feeling okay about this so far. Speaking about, I don't know if I want to transition with speaking about feeling okay. This is Super Deep Borehole, illicit industrial assets, 6 to res, 6 to trash, all the influence. And when you res this, you load bad publicity on it. That's a strange sentence. And then when your turn begins, you remove a bad publicity, which means the runner gets it. It means you get 3 credits in the outfit. And if this has no bad publicity on it, you just win the game. It's really cool to have alternate win conditions, not only in standard, but also in startup. But this is a bit of a ridiculous win condition. It's also interesting how this gets so much attention, yet I think Vientiane Keeling is a very similar card that is probably a bit more playable than this one. But this is the, oh, cool, alternate win condition. I'm going to pursue that, albeit maybe it's the worst of the two. What do you think about this thing? Can you, in a world of pinhole threadings, in a world of endurances and boomerangs and all that, can you protect this for, it's functionally 5 turns, right? Actually 6, because it has to. Well, I guess if you don't res it, it's kind of a rough trash.
Yeah, but if the runner's trashing this unrest, you're clapping all like you're laughing all the way to the bank, right?
And that's the funny thing too is like
I spent the
runners are going to hit this. Sorry, so runners are going to run into this and then see that you haven't res it, and they might wait because they want to take on the 2 or 3 bad publicity. Maybe the outfit changes that a bit, especially with the agenda. But yeah, maybe sometimes this isn't a trash on site.
Yeah, I think that you really only can evaluate. Like, I think you're right that like, oh yeah, pinholes everywhere. Like, yeah, this card's not going to survive a pinhole. I don't think that just because the you win the game text is going to fire pretty rarely means that makes the card unplayable, I guess. Because when I'm looking at this card, I'm saying, oh, great. I don't need to res as many illicit ice to turn on my regulatory captures. Yeah. And I'm also presenting the runner a threat they do have to go and deal with at some point. And And so that means that like I know somewhere around turn, 3 turns, 4 turns after I res this, I actually can dictate what the runner's turn is going to be.
Yeah.
And that can sometimes be really valuable for opening up a window for you to do some other kind of aggressive play. So again, I think this fits into this kind of outfit style deck that's looking to like just present, like throw a bunch of problems at you and say, you're going to run out of solutions before I run out of problems. And this is just one of the problems it's going to use to make that your life difficult.
I think I'm the most excited about the hubris that this is going to expose in runners, where they see it and they be like, "Oh, I'll run it in 2 turns from now. Like it's only a Tithonium or something. It's only a Bulwark." And then at that point, it's like border control and then a Zato grid, and they're like, "Oh, I should have ran it before." And they're just trying to milk it. It's also interesting in the outfit too, right? Like this pays off at the same speed as something like a refuge campaign or a pad campaign. Like on turn 1, it's negative. On turn 2, it's equal. On turn 3, it's actually positive. Admittedly, the bad publicity itself fuels the runner, but like as a raw econ card, it's like not awful, but it's
well,
shouldn't
and
last.
it's got a high, like it's a really, unlike those cards, it's got a really high trash cost, right?
Yeah.
Like 6 is pretty meaningfully different from 2 and 4.
But you're assuming it's like at least 5 or 4, considering there's bad publicity, right? Like the trash cost is not the real trash cost.
For sure, but you're going to get paid out before that trash cost goes down.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the way I'm looking at that trash cost going down. The other thing is, if you ice it, that trash cost is still going to be 6 after they break the ice. So
sure. Yeah. I don't know. To me, this feels like it's weird. Like this card that says you can win the game, the way that you're describing it, the way I see it to some extent too, is more of an enabler than as an actual win condition, which is fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good to be pretty conservative with the first card you print that says when you win the game, because if it's too good, it just suddenly the whole game of Netrunner stops being about Netrunner and becomes the game of Super Deep Borehole. And I think that's, nothing people wanted. So
the fact that this is not unique, I don't think it actually matters that much, but I think it's hilarious in terms of what Weyland's up to. Like it's just a thing they're doing. It's not the big thing they're doing.
Yeah, it's fine. They just, they're just building they're just doing 3 different boreholes at the same time. And like,
Siberia is big, huh?
It's actually, yeah. I think this is, we can put this in niche. I think that's you're really wanting to put this in niche, it sounds like.
Well, no, because it's like clearly an archetype role player. It's just like,
yeah,
I don't know. Like I kind of believe you. If this existed without regulatory capture, I think it would be absolutely nonsense. Like speed running bad pub is now actually a thing you kind of want to do.
Yeah. No, I think this only makes sense in the context of regulatory capture.
Yeah. So is that a weak archetype role player or?
Yeah, maybe this is just a weak archetype role player then.
Something like that.
I might put it. Hold on. I have your OBS window blocking exactly where you put that. Yeah. I think I like this more than Kimberlite Field, but I think you like Kimberlite Field more than I like, and I think Jutrust Grid is better than regulatory capture. So it's like
then Borehole, you mean, right?
Yeah. Excuse me. Borehole. Yes.
Okay. Kimberlite's for me. We'll just say that one's for me. I get a bit of.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Sure.
Yeah. My spoiler card, whatever. All right. We got the only Weyland ice in the set, and this is Anvil. Love the art on this one. When the runner encounters this ice, it's a code gate, mind you, 4 to res, 3 strength. When the runner encounters this, you may trash one of your installed cards. Classic op. If you do, the runner cannot break this ice printed subroutines for the remainder of this encounter. Not for the run, for this encounter. That's functionally the same. I don't think you're going to gank people into this. It has 2 subroutines, gain a credit, lose a credit. The runner loses a credit, that is. And it says the runner trashes one of their installed cards. And now that's obviously their choice. If they only have 1 installed card in the early game because they're running through this with an endurance, that's a huge success. The hammer connects. This thing's really strange, right? Like, it's a card that you probably only want to play in op because trashing your installed cards is a really high cost. And in op, it's not only sometimes not a cost, but it's a benefit. In fact, a massive benefit if people are running last click into this thing, because then you can trash a 4-coster, say, to get like a Bast Chiriboga, fast advance piece, a Reaper function. Like there's so many things that you can get if they run through this last click. And this means that you have a border control type effect that you can trash at basically any single encounter as long as that matters. Like the fact that they can run through an Anvil and then you can pull a Mana Garm without having to like pop your border control. Like that's cool. That's cool. Admittedly, too many of these on the server, op falls apart. What do you think about this? I think my biggest issue with this is that it costs 4.
Well, I think that's secretly an upside for a lot of op decks. So I think this is a really difficult. I think actually the downside. So let me pitch both both parts of the 4 cost. The upside is for combo lists, there's a lot of really valuable things at 3 cost that you want to get.
Yes.
The biggest one is like the mutually assured Bass Biotic combo lists.
Yep.
This is now another 4 cost card, and as a 4 cost card, you're pretty happy to play because it will sometimes be really relevant, and it will also probably like people will say, I don't like whenever the runner basically encounters this, they're giving you a choice, and generally people are very averse unless they know your corp really well and your game plan really well to giving you choices because they don't know what you're going to do with them.
Yeah.
And so if you res this on a central, I think most runners are going to say, let's run a different place. And so a 4 cost piece of ice turning off a central server is like a really, really nice effect.
It kind of feels like Vasilisa, which was the closest ice to that effect in the set, where it's like that's a small ice, but like the effect is actually very warping on certain board states.
Yeah. Now, the downside of this being a 4 cost code gate is there are really good competition in the 4 cost code gate slot in Weyland already. The two being Whoredom, which ends the run, which Anvil doesn't do, and Mausolus, which is higher strength and has, I would argue, more annoying subroutines.
Yep. Hard to break. Nobody breaks so well. It's worth noting Black Orchestra breaks this for 3 credits if they are breaking it. That's not the worst for a 4 credit ice, but it's a mild difference between something like a Mausolus.
Yeah, and the runner trashing their worst installed card is often not a subroutine that either player cares about.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I had a 1 tick left daily cast. Oh, I trashed a bin breaker and I've got credits on a paladin to reinstall it. Like, there's maybe against criminal, this is slightly more relevant, but even then, sometimes they're going to have a stranded boomerang. They're like, yeah, sure, whatever, you know.
Yeah, it's the same sort of play pattern that people played into back in the day into SDS drone deployment. Whereas like early game, you would install like a leech or like a bankroll or even a Rozeki. Just not at that point, you're risking the trash program subroutines, which weren't as popular as they were post Baby Stavka. But it was the way that you played into SDS. You installed something cheap, a program that you could get rid of, and yeah, you can still do that.
Yeah, exactly. So like there is that kind of safety valve on this card becoming dominant in the meta, and so it's the other thing is like even in op, you have to have your res card really has to be your trash card has to be resed for this to be relevant.
Oh yeah,
and so there's going to be board states where you don't have enough res cards to get value out of this on encounter ability, and so the runner is just going to kind of waltz through, and those subroutines we were just talking about aren't always the most impactful. So it's got some real downsides that the other 4 cost code gates don't really have. So I'm a little skeptical this is going to see a lot of play until those cards go away.
Yep. That being said, the big upside here is that you can op on basically any encounter on any run, and that can be flexible. Again, if you put too many op triggers though in a single server, like eventually you run out of op value and you actually start trashing things and not getting stuff back. But like the fact that you can pull 3 costers on any run, even when they don't expect it, is kind of cool. But honestly, if this costs 3 cost, like obviously you could lower the strength, you can do whatever you want. The 3 cost slot is a bit more forgiving than the 4 cost slot, which you have a lot of good stuff in already.
And this is probably a central's only piece of ice. Really doesn't do what you want on a remote, which can be tricky for some op decks.
That's a good point. Yeah, I've only played this on a remote so far because of I've been playing Ampere. That's my own problem. But yeah, it's much better on a central server. Is that niche? I don't even know if it's going to show up in most op lists.
I feels like it's going to be an op role player to me because like the ability is so clearly designed for op.
Sure, but I just feel like we have better stuff to play in that slot.
That's fair. I feel like it could maybe be high in niche then.
Yeah, it's either low archetype role player or high niche. We both enjoy op. You want to put it up one for the op?
Yeah, I think high. Let's just leave it top of niche. I think that's let's stick to our gut, stick to the urge of our convictions, whatever that phrase is.
Yeah, cool. All right, this is probably gonna be the best card that we're gonna rank potentially the lowest, which is End of the Line. It's Scorched Earth all over again. As additional cost to play this 3 cost 4 influence card, you have to remove a tag. That's different than Scorched Earth in a very meaningful way, and it just does 4-8 damage. So yeah, Sundog's dead. Fantastic. How do you play this modernly? It's so hard to play this modernly. Like that's the biggest issue. Everyone's removing tags.
Oh no! This goes really easily in mutually assured destruction.
Yes, that's the only way.
Instead of the boom combo.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's not the only way. Like, I do think there's some like I think we're going to see, at least while people are still exploring the meta, some core damage and the line kills. Like, I think that's a very legitimate archetype.
I've tried that, and people
Um,
just play it. What's it like? You cannot do distributed tracings to trash and what's it called? No free lunges. Like you can't.
oh, okay, so you have to really commit to the bit and start slotting best defenses in.
And then where's the money of the deck, right? Like none of it makes sense. You already have so many awkward, expensive cards, and now you're putting even more in the deck.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's hard.
Yeah, I no, this card's a lot of commitment, and like, yeah, you could probably play Boom, which is more card slot efficient. This has, I would say, some upsides relative to Boom,
Yeah,
in
for
that
sure.
if there are board states where one tag is actually easier to get, the runners will sometimes goof up on you, and it's also not trashable,
Yep.
which is not a meaningless part of it either.
So like
Um,
the big thing to me is that you want to make this lethal on surprising board states. The sort of board states where like they take suddenly they lose a card to like a Vera agenda you've left on the table. Not very realistic. Or they've got like a Vancian trigger or a Reaper function hits them out of nowhere. Or something or like then hostile architecture has lowered their hand size. And now they're on 3 cards. And at this point they haven't set up their anti-tag punishment. And then you do like public trail into this or like distributed tracing into this. Like that is where you can get somebody. But I think you have to be rushing. It has to be on tempo. You have to force it where it's awkward for them to put this card and they can play slow enough to respect it. And maybe again, they have to not just expect this thing coming, but it's asking for a lot. You have to go real fast.
It is. I mean, I will say, like, that style of play, like, when you describe the deck, I'm like, oh yeah, that was Argus in 2019. Like, so there is historical precedent. We may not be in the meta for that to exist, but I could also see, like, hey, if everyone's being a super like going maximum greed runner and playing World Tree, and they're just like, I'm gonna slam World Tree and run every turn, like, well, they're probably giving themselves some windows, even though they can tutor tech out from their deck.
That's the problem with World Tree,
Um,
right? Like they just pulled their Citadel, they just pulled their no free lunches. So it's even harder sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's really like you don't play end of the like well you I think the thing with end of the line to me is you can either play it as sort of part of a tempo check or like a a speed check card, which is going to be difficult to do,
Mhm.
very difficult to do in this meta,
Yeah.
or you go all in. Like there's Opolis out there that just say, hey, the big way that there was a style of Opolis that was like, I'm going to run a fractal threat matrix so that I can guarantee do the Boom Biotic combo. But Boom was too unreliable because sometimes the one would trash out of my hand.
Yep.
Well, now I can just play 2 end of lines instead. So if you lean all in, this is maybe another option for those style decks.
Yeah. No, it's so we also saw Scorched Earth come back out when they did the like rotation that that window where we had the best of cards. And even then Scorched Earth, which is a much better card than this, didn't see any play. And admittedly back then we had access to Boom and we also had access to high profile target. And I think that also makes it a bit clumsy. But like the idea was if you can tag people with say like a mutually assured destruction, usually just having a single Boom while it's trashable. And we did have archive memories back then, could be a bit more consistent. So even then, like I don't even know if this is the best mad use case with mutually assured destruction compared to just like slotting Boom.
Yeah.
It's
I
hard.
don't know. I was personally finding the Boom being trash from my hand was like crippling.
Yeah, runners
And
are
so I was often trying to leave them in my deck and score with Atlas counters, so it was in my hand invisibly.
yeah, runners are a bit
But
more
yeah, no,
aggressive.
you're definitely not wrong about this card having a lot of downsides.
Yeah, it's just the meta, right? Like this is just a really good card outside of a no free lunch world. Like it's obviously super super good, and it's a very direct win condition for like even specifically core damage decks. This is how I think a core damage deck probably closes the game. But unfortunately, you can tech into that really easily. Where does that mean we put this thing?
I mean, to me, this is clearly set up to be like a faction staple, and not even just an in-faction staple, but like a cross-faction
Yeah, I
staple in a
agree.
lot of ways.
But like not a successful one
Um,
modernly. Like that's the problem. Like I do think, yeah, you're right. It's the conversation about end of the line is going to be ongoing for the next 4 years of Netrunner for sure. Whether or not it succeeds is a different thing. Like it's just a win condition card that's very very playable, but probably in some ways not.
Yeah, I mean, so to me, it goes in that top row. I would probably put it to the left of the ice, or not the top. Yeah,
Yeah, it's wild. It's like that's a very very powerful card, and I do think, yeah, I do think by definition it's going to be a faction staple. I just Yeah, I don't know. I still think Boom might be better right now. And even that's a hard card to play. It's a really hard card to play.
Yeah, but it's also important to remember, like, hey, Boom rotates in hopefully in 6 months. So
Yeah, and we didn't mention this does beat a single stone chip, which was a Boom problem, so that's always kind of nice.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's enough for me to look at this in combo op.
Yeah,
So
for sure. Okay, we only got two more Weyland cards. This is a card that I'm actually excited to hear your thoughts of. I'm not going to say my thoughts of this because I know you're a huge fan of this one. This is Yakov. It's an executive, costs 2 to res, 2 to trash, 2 influence, has 2 on everything. And when a player trashes a card, whenever a player, so that's you or the opponent, again, as op, you trash your own cards, including this upgrade from the root of the server or protecting this server, except during installation. Gain 2 credits. Why is this awesome?
so to some extent, this card on its own is basically credit neutral, just kind of guaranteed, because you're going to res this only, like, you're only going to res this when it's going to pay out the first time. And then the runner trashes it, you're at +2 credits for you, -2 credits for the runner. That's already a pretty reasonable value.
Do you think
And
the
then by
runner
the time you get your
trashes
second
this?
trigger, oh yeah.
Yeah.
If they don't trash this, this is your econ. This is an econ engine that can carry you through the entire game. You don't actually need that many credits.
Yeah.
And like saying, oh yeah, I'm going to trash your border control, make 2 credits, and grab a piece of ice to put on this remote is pretty good. And maybe now, if you're playing that kind of fast advanced style op, you play calibration testing instead of BAS, because that can go in the server with the agenda, and you like keep
Oh,
shaking
that's
these
cool.
out.
Yeah, because it's not an asset. It's also like we're gonna see the next card works really well with this. Also, to some extent, Anvil works well with this. That you actually can just liquidate your ice in a pinch, which is expensive, but like not the worst.
The other stuff that works well with this, Rashida Jaheim, 3
Wow.
of in every single deck.
Yep.
And then also Gaslight, I think, works quite well with this for a lot of op decks, because you just put this in your remote and like the runner has to decide, am I going to go and get this? And then if they don't, hey, great, I get an operation and I get 2 credits out of it. So like, yes, it's not going to win you the game. It's not like a completely bonkers card, but it's quietly quite good. And like you can even throw this on like your Maryland campaign or your launch campaign and increase the value of those.
Yeah, that's
Also, it's not
weird.
your ideal play,
Yeah, it's an
but like
option.
it stacks with extract, so I can
Yeah.
put an asset in the remote, extract it away. Like it's sort of like an amplifier of everything. It's not an amazing card on its own, but it takes everything you were already doing and just bumps it up a little bit more in a way that doesn't give the runner a ton of options to play around, which I think is a powerful thing to think about.
Yeah, I think 2 things to point out too is like this is really good with mutually assured destruction because you get all your money when you liquidate a whole server with this in it. That's great. It's also a card you don't mind to trash to mad if the server disintegrates. Why not give them another tag? But I think a big thing here is that it costs 2, and like the 2 cost slot in op decks is like not particularly contested. So this is one of the easiest things
Yeah.
you can grab onto. It's not ice, but the 2 cost ice slot was like Formicary and then some weird stuff. It wasn't particularly
Yeah,
consistent.
and you didn't want to fetch Formicary anyway.
Yeah.
You wanted Formicary unres.
Unres.
So like most people, myself included, were running Regalith mining license, and it's like, well, maybe I just put this instead of the Regalith mining license, and because it's a clickless economy, at least in theory,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
can maybe come out kind of equal.
And like cool
So,
things like Mavirus too that you can pop now for 1 credit, and then or hopefully you got it for free too. So you're like building your own Cyberdeck sandbox, get something else on the turn. Like there's some cool plays there. Yeah, this is neat.
yeah, no, yeah, no, that's actually a really important line to shout out as well. Is Cyberdeck's sandbox was, or sorry,
Mavirus,
Virus
yeah.
was already in a lot of decks of op lists, and like, yeah, it goes on that really well.
Yeah, no, you're selling me. It's like one of the weird things with the op is like if you have a very robust op deck, I don't know, watching B Blum play at World, it's like the amount of stuff that goes in and out of the server across turns, like there's a lot of trashes that happen, and that's potentially a lot of money. And at least it's neutral if the Yako gets trashed himself, which is great.
Yeah, yeah. Like this is often like it's not hard for this to hit a hedge fund's level of value. So that's and it's potentially tutorable. So like it's got a lot of little upside. It's not going to like make Ob suddenly tier 0 on its own.
No,
it's going to be a really nice little engine piece for Op.
Yeah, it also quietly wins games, which is always really subtle because then your opponent doesn't respect it. And that's kind of good for you.
Yeah.
Cool. Where's it go? It's definitely like an archetype thing, but like if Op's the whole entire Weyland faction, you know?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think I'm probably putting this might be my highest archetype role player.
Yeah.
because I wouldn't be surprised if if I'm a little bit too high on the card relative to what we actually see. So I struggle to put this in faction staple, but
there's so many op cards we did in Midnight Sun, which was the top of archetype role player, because we're like, this is an op archetype. It's the best archetype, but you don't play this outside of op, and I think that's a good place to put that card too.
yeah.
All right, last Weyland card, and this is a Zato City Grid. It's a region, again, non-unique. You can put these everywhere. One region per server, remote server only, actually, so you can't really put it everywhere the same way you could with Nen Civic. And it says each piece of ice protecting the server gains. When the runner encounters this ice, choose a subroutine, trash the ice, resolve that subroutine. So exact same way that the last grid, the shark grid worked, the subroutine is just going to fire. It doesn't matter what icebreakers, it doesn't matter what endurance you have, that's just going to fire, which means in op, where trashing your ice is not the worst cost, and sometimes it's actually credit positive. You can go find something else in your deck, go get paid off from Yakov. That can be as banal as border control tribal deck, where all your end the runs get thrown at the runner to end the run, or can have some really mean subroutines, trash program subroutines, trash installed card subroutines, give tag subroutines, give massive net damage or meat damage subroutines potentially. This is incredibly flexible, albeit very expensive, but I think it's also worth considering outside of op and even out of action, which is wild.
Yeah, no, I think you've hit everything I would want to say about this card. It's I think that it is deceptive how big the cost of triggering this card is.
Yeah.
Like, I actually think it's both more expensive to res and more expensive to use than something like Nana Civic Grid.
Yep.
But you have a lot of, you do in exchange have more agency as the Corp, and like your ice, you don't have, like, nothing's forcing you to use the Zato, and you can use your ice like multiple ways. So yeah, no, this card's I think gonna be you're gonna have to think about this card when you're building your runner deck, at least until we find out exactly how the meta is gonna settle. But I would not be surprised if this long term is part of the meta considerations.
And this is like something that kind of falls to me like Kimberlite Field, where in theory, if people are using this as like a very, what people would consider classically unfair program destruction deck that just fires like, oh, my Rototurret isn't doing much here, throw it, the Sapper, throw it, right? And you can just pull down programs, which admittedly against 2/3 of the factions doesn't really matter that much unless you put additional cards on top of that. This opens archetypes and this becomes a deck building consideration. This is a thing that in certain metas, you can imagine you have to build your deck to beat this. I don't think we're going to get anywhere near that, but like it has a huge potential ceiling on decks that can just stop certain matchups.
Yeah, those rig shooter type decks. Yeah. This is like a huge shot in the arm to this archetype that has really not been, I would say since Scorpios rotated, has just not been on the map.
And might not be on the map until the next rotation where we lose, all the conspiracy breakers. Because once Anarch actually has to worry about breakers, like, whoa, that's a big difference in the power of this thing.
Yeah, suddenly this easily triggering on 2/3 of the factions and probably still being effective against Shaper is relevant.
Yeah, so. Yeah. This is also like one of the not like you have to like throw a trebuchet to sink the boat, and I do think you could consider playing this in a lockout type outfit deck. I do think the fact that this is one of the unfair ways to stop a boat run is quite meaningful, and that's something that a lot of people might want to look into, because endurance, honestly, that's a different question, whether endurance has really changed in value with the set. We haven't really addressed that. I don't think we're probably going to, but this is one of the few cards that's has a good enough endurance matchup.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think this is definitely an archetype role player card, and it's an archetype that's maybe still a bit undersupported, but it is quite powerful, I think.
I don't want to say it's as a faction staple, because I do think like it's like kind of end of the line. I think it has the ability to close games. I think it has an ability to be one of the most important cards. Even the mind space, like if this is res in a remote server and there's mean subroutines on that server, how do you run it? Right? Like if it's end the run tag, right? You run it, they end the run, you run it again, end the run, you run it again, you now end your turn with a tag. Like that is the sort of thing that I think actually entire decks can be built around. I think it's very clumsy. I think it's a bit expensive, and like, obviously it's a pinhole threading and all that, but I don't know. I think it's so flexible that it might be above an archetype.
Okay. I'm fine with putting it up there.
Like I want to put it around here.
I think that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe even I'm going to keep going until you get upset. Here.
Oh, I think I might already be upset.
All right, cool. We have one more card in the set. Again, we'll readdress this. And this is the only neutral Corp card. We were promised neutral factions, and on the Corp side, there's only one of them, and that is Ampere. That's this one here. It is 45 infinite influence. You can do whatever you want, but there are some guardrails here. Firstly, you cannot include more than one copy of any card. It doesn't matter if it's a neutral faction card. Mind you, neutral technically isn't a faction. And then your deck can only include up to 2 different, of course, agendas from each major corp faction. Again, neutral isn't a faction. You can play all the neutral agendas, one of them if you want. This is interesting and is the other side of Nova, which we'll talk about the runner side, which is a very similar card, almost the same text on it identically. But I think they're very, very different cards as a whole. Um, what do you think about this thing?
So I think this is the card that is brutalized the most by this tier system.
Yes.
As I think this card is effectively unplayable.
Yes.
But I'm super glad it's printed.
Yeah, this thing needs its own tier, which is Ampere. And like physically where that tier goes, it's at the bottom. But like, I am so stoked that this exists. And okay, we got to talk about why that's the case, right? And it's a very interesting study into Netrunner. Like the comparison between this and Nova, a bit of a spoiler. I think Nova is actually pretty all right. I think Nova can be quite good as a runner with a blank ID with infinite influence one-ofs. Like that's actually not bad. As a corporation, it's pretty butt. And the big reason is overall, like, look at all the competitive corp IDs. They leverage their identity specifically to win the game. They need to do something with their identity, either to gain some sort of advantage, do something that's hard to interact with, or generate economy. Runners can kind of just win games on accident, right? Like you can have some additional card draw, you can have additional value, but like you can just put down endurance and Stargate and just kind of win a game. Like that happens. And it's just so hard for a corporation. And well, I do think most of my Ampere testing to date has just been like generic mid-range. Like I'm gonna put enough fast advanced tools. You can put all the 3/2s you can possibly imagine to one deck. It's just not enough to win the game. And where I think I'm more interested in building Ampere decks is focusing a bit more, right? Like play every single card that's a net damage trap or a tag trap in one deck. And hopefully that's enough things that's hard enough for the runner to play around. And that's one of the big strengths of the neutral corporation. It's really hard to play around it. A lot of times when you're playing against HB, you're playing against something like Thule, you can kind of guess what the assets or the upgrades are. Against this, is it a Mwanza? Is it a Prysac? Is it like an Amaze Amusements? Like that is the one benefit of this corporation over anything else on the field. But it's just so hard to consistently set up something and then consistently have the appropriate punishment and then still try to close the game out at the same time. Like that's, I feel like you need a win condition that's not scored a 7 because this thing cannot score a 7.
I think it could in some metas score to 7. Like this idea of like, oh, hey, I can run all of the most taxing ice. And yeah, I only get to run one of the most taxing ice.
Yeah.
But like, you know, maybe there's a configuration where you can make that work because you're like, oh yeah, I've got a Fairchild 3, I've got an Ansel, I've also got an Endless Eula, I've got like just like piling these all up.
But how do you res that? It's 18 credits. There's so many problems. It's like, oh man, it's been so rough. And then on top of that, not having 3 spin doctors, and immediately you can run like 1 spin doctor, a sprint, an attitude adjustment, the new simulation reset.
Yeah.
But still, then you just have clunker hands where like I have a bunch of pseudo blank 3/2s on this board state, and they're just an HQ. And I don't have an economy, and I can't res my ice until I get my economy sorted. But I'm just hoping the top deck goes well. Like it feels so much worse than playing the runner.
No, it definitely does. And I think the one potential for this to end up being really good, well, maybe not the one, but I think a potential way for this to end up really good is if we start getting agendas that do stuff to other scored agendas, because then suddenly you can start doing stuff cross-faction that's not like balanced for, right? There are none of those in the pool right now.
Yep.
It is historically an archetype that doesn't see a ton of interaction, but you know, if we get some of those cards that do stuff when agendas are scored or stolen that are generally kind of meant to be separated out between different factions, this identity can start doing stuff that's cool competitively.
I agree with you. And that's the sort of like real interesting thing here. It's one of the things that this can do uniquely is play agendas from different factions. So you can start inventing some sort of board state where it's like, oh, I have this Weyland agenda that does this, and then I have this Jinteki agenda that does this, like a viral weaponization into something. Like you can maybe make something unfair, but then it comes down to the fact that they're one-ofs. So like the chance of having that combo exist, like you need so many inter combos that like any, you know, salad hand is playable. And it's just like it blue moons. Like every once in a while it does something really good, but then like 8 out of 10, it's real ugly.
Yeah. It's also it's always also going to be dependent on how many tutors are available
Yeah.
for the cards you're interested in, and there's not a ton of tutors on the Corp side at the moment, so this idea is going to look even worse. Whereas like on the runner side, there's a lot of tutors,
Oh, and they're good.
and something that's like that's the way the game is designed, and so Ampere might always underperform a little bit relative to the runner version of it.
Yeah. So
Um,
it's unfair. It's like 6 out of 10, but it's also like total trash if you ask me. It's so
yeah,
fun to play.
no,
Well,
it's like
mm,
it's I don't know that it's a ton of fun to play, but it's also probably one of those decks I'm going to always bring to a meetup
yes.
because there's going to be someone where like I'm just more competitive than they are, and it's not fun for me to like bring my highly tuned op deck up against them. So we'll just pull out our Ampere Nova lists and like just have a good time playing Netrunner.
But
And I
like
think that this card is great for that.
that's what I thought too. And then I played a Nova list and felt like I was in control. And I played an Ampere list and I felt like I was not making plays. Like I'm just clicking for credits. And I hate that feeling. I hate a deck that doesn't have a proactive plan. Also, like bringing this as like a new player tool to be like, oh, you have to read every
Totally.
single
There-
card. Like that's also kind of
Yeah, yeah.
ugly.
No, this isn't a new player
Yeah.
tool. This is for like when I meet up with friends who are just like not super competitive players, but love Netrunner. This is a great thing for us to sit down. And if we need to house rule it and say, hey, you know what, we need to balance Ampere a little bit, I think this is a great idea for like that invites some of that house ruling to kind of make it a more enjoyable experience for everyone.
Yeah. And like, again, I love the fact that there's like now you can play like the standalone, the commander, the one of format where there's all just Amperes versus Novas. But I worry that that's also a huge one-sided kind of thing. So I don't even know if I'm excited for that format
Yeah.
exactly. But like I'm definitely gonna be
Yeah,
trying more Ampere stuff. It's like such a cool puzzle. It just inherently is such an uphill fight.
Yeah, I really like the proposal. I think this might have been yours of like, hey, you can also get the get a when score, like you get an agenda text active at the beginning of the game. You don't get the points from that agenda, but like you can get an
Yeah.
agenda text active as sort of your ID ability.
It's like
Might be a nice.
Commander for Magic, from my understanding, or like Ocarina is the format that's like that, but they don't enforce one-ups. But I think there's something in there where you can, get this to be even more interesting than the puzzle that it presents itself. I just think competitively, if you bring an Ampere deck to a standard tournament, I would bet big money that you're so far behind the curve.
Yeah, no, it's a real struggle.
Yeah, which is not the
My
case for
goodness, it's
Nova.
snowing outside, and I completely missed that.
Sorry? Oh, it started snowing?
Yeah, we've got not less than an inch probably, but I've just completely missed it.
Hey, winter's coming. Oh, that's sick.
Just real focus, but
Okay, so we
cool.
gotta put this somewhere, and I do think that's going to be a failure of our list, where this needs its own shelf of like, I'm so glad this is a thing. Like, I don't want to put it into shame. Unfortunately, like I wish this was a bit more interesting or had a bit more upside to it. Like maybe a 40 deck minimum would actually make it boring because then you just play, 6 3-pointers, and I'd also hate it. But it's just short of being exciting to me from what I've played so far. But I love that it exists. I think it's the coolest thing.
Yeah, no, I think to me this I don't know I would really struggle to call this niche because I think the niche cards have a role and I just don't see a role for Ampere
No.
without entirely different card pool. Yeah, I think
Ew.
that's right. I think that's right.
Love the card.
And like again, yeah, it's a great card. I do, like I will always play against people that want to play. Well, maybe not always. Maybe sometimes on stream I'll want to be a little bit more try hard grindy. But no, I will. I think Ampere will be. I'm super glad it exists, which I don't think is something I can say for everything else in the shame pile in our video so far. But it's just not meant for competitive play, and I think that's totally reasonable.
I'm really excited to review this in a month where people find out there's some list that's inconsistent but potentially busted powerful with some wild combo. And if that's the case, so be it. But like currently from just generic testing, oh boy. But that leaves us here. We can take a second now, either on or off camera, to figure out if we need to move anything around here. As a whole, like looking down on it, we have, I think, maybe we're a bit more generous, but our bell curve is at least less weight centered in the middle, which is great. We have a lot of strong faction stables. I think we saw Jinteki just get a lot of really strong flexible cards, which is great. The NBN stuff is all like tag punishment stuff, which is, classically been what they've been doing for a really long time. And then you have some unfair tricks and traps, which generally people like. And then we have some ice on the end, which we always just put some ice on the end that just generally doesn't see a lot of play, and we call it a faction staple. It's just what we do here.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of that is also like Signal has talked about trying to depower ice slightly, and so yeah, all this ice is like we're evaluating this in a pool that's got Fairchild DNA Tracker like
Yeah.
just some really annoncing, like these really powerful ice, and these guys are aiming to not do that. So,
Is there anything you feel strongly about that we goofed it here?
uh, I would maybe move Reaper and Vampire Nessa down to archetype role player.
Okay. Whereabouts? Like Reaper falls
Probably
pretty.
right around.
I think Reaper falls around here, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's pretty. I was gonna say, yeah, I think that's actually correct. Probably.
And Vampire Nessa, I do think that Unsmiling is a bit more interesting than Vampire Nessa. I do think a lot of people would just
Yeah.
dismiss Vampire Nessa. I think that would have to go around here-ish.
It's like you're reading my mind.
Hey, fantastic. And this is good too, because now there's less folding in on itself. It's an easier to look at rectangle, which is fantastic.
Exactly right. I'm surprised that like because Zato and Nana Civic Grid were both like super big conversational points, but I don't think either of them really actually approach Ban Me Please.
No, they don't.
Despite their strength.
Well, okay, so I would like to say that Nana Civic Grid and to some extent Zato Grid, I think they could eventually hit Ban Me Please in the same way that cards like Wave and Loki could do Ban Me Please. I think they could exist in a singular deck that is really poisonous and hard to deal with and is a bit of a grind and has a bit of like that eventuality that we saw in some of the Ag Infusion lists at Worlds. But I don't think as a whole that's exactly what it means. But I do think those are the sort of cards where there's a risk of something unfair happening.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Yeah, there's definitely some swings at unfair cards in this set,
Yeah.
and so it'll be interesting to see how they land. But I think like Gaslight is generically powerful in the way that, and obviously powerful in the way that some of these more tricky to use cards are not.
Yeah, cool. Well, hey, that's all the Corp cards we got. I forget how many, 30 something in this side of the set. We're gonna have the runner cards coming up. That should be on my channel hopefully in a couple days. But of course, in the comments, Parhelion is just out. You've been playing it as well. I hope. Hopefully, you've been having a good time. The cards should be up for sale, I reckon, by the time this video is up. So let us know in the comments here what you've been excited about, what we're the most correct about, what we're the most wrong about. But hopefully, you've been enjoying Parhelion as much. Jeff, what do you have to say on this?
Yeah, thank you all for watching. It's always nice to see that people enjoy these videos, and they should be on the lookout for the other half of this. And don't be too mean to us. We've only been playing Parhelion for less than 48 hours.
Standing, I'm gonna be real confident about this one. No, you can come at me. That's fine. Just respectfully. Thank you. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, thanks for watching, everyone.